Ryan Caldwell lunged forward, grabbed a fistful of her torn jacket, and yanked her sideways in front of the entire formation, snarling that the Navy had sent them a broken old relic who didn't belong anywhere near a real weapon. He shoved her back a step, laughing as she stumbled, daring her to say something, anything in her own defense. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody dared. What Ryan Caldwell didn't know was that his hands had just touched the arm of a legend, and within the hour, that same arm would end his arrogance forever. Before we go any further, if stories about quiet strength, underestimated warriors, and respect earned the hard way, speak to you, hit that subscribe button, and stay with me to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every one. The sun had not even fully cleared the ridgeline when the first insult of the day was already flying. Ryan Caldwell stood at the front of the formation with his arms crossed, chest puffed out, boots planted like he owned the desert beneath him. He was 26 years old, an Army Ranger candidate with 2 overseas deployments already stamped on his record, and he wanted every single person on that training range to know it. "You nervous, Briggs?" he said, elbowing the recruit next to him, a quieter young man named Tommy Briggs who kept adjusting the strap on his rifle like it might fall apart if he didn't. "No," Tommy said, though his voice cracked just slightly on the word. "Good, because today's the day they separate the operators from the tourists," Ryan grinned, "and I don't plan on going home a tourist." A few recruits chuckled. Not because it was funny, but because laughing along with Ryan Caldwell was easier than being his next target. Jenna Ruiz stood a few feet away, arms folded, watching him with an expression that had long since stopped being amused. She was a Marine reconnaissance candidate, sharp-eyed, quiet, until she wasn't, and she had learned in the first week of this evaluation that Ryan Caldwell's mouth moved faster than his brain. "You keep talking like that," she said under her breath, "and one day it's going to catch up to you." "What was that, Ruiz?" "Nothing," she said. "Just admiring the view of your ego. It's got its own zip code." Ryan smirked and turned away, already bored of her. That was the thing about him. He never held onto an insult long enough to actually feel it. He simply moved on to the next target. He didn't know it yet, but his next target was about to walk onto that range. The training area sat inside a stretch of hardened desert near the Naval Special Warfare Advanced Training Facility outside Yuma, Arizona. Recruits from 3 branches had been pulled together for what the paperwork called a Joint Combat Readiness Evaluation. Unofficially, everyone just called it the filter because it was designed to strip away every recruit who wasn't ready for what came next. Captain Michael Reynolds stood near the command tent, reviewing a clipboard, his face unreadable behind mirrored sunglasses. Reynolds had run this evaluation for 6 years. He had watched hundreds of confident young men and women walk onto this range believing they already knew everything worth knowing. He was about to watch that belief get tested in a way none of them expected. "Sir," said a younger officer beside him. "She's here." Reynolds looked up. "Good. Send her in." That was when she appeared. She walked from the direction of the parking area alone, no escort, no announcement, carrying nothing but a small canvas bag over one shoulder. She wore a jacket that looked like it had been dragged through a decade of hard use. The fabric was faded to a color that was no longer quite green and no longer quite brown. One sleeve had a rough patch stitched over what looked like a burn mark. The collar was frayed. A tear along the left shoulder had been sewn shut with thread that didn't match the rest of the material. She looked tired. She looked plain. She looked to every single recruit watching her approach like someone who had wandered onto the wrong training range by mistake. "Is that a joke?" Ryan muttered to Tommy. "I don't know," Tommy said. "That jacket looks like it lost a fight with a lawnmower." A ripple of laughter spread down the line. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even turn her head toward the sound. She walked directly toward Captain Reynolds, exchanged a few quiet words with him, and then turned to face the recruits for the first time. Her eyes moved down the line slowly, unhurried, like she was reading something written on each of their faces. When her gaze reached Ryan Caldwell, it stopped there for just a second longer than anywhere else. He felt it, though he would never admit that later. Something about the way she looked at him made the back of his neck prickle. Then she looked away, and the feeling passed, and his confidence came rushing back in to fill the space it had left behind. "Recruits," Reynolds said, "this is Senior Chief Emily Carter. She'll be assisting with today's evaluation." That was all he said. No rank history, no unit, no explanation of why a woman in a torn jacket was standing on their firing line. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds before Ryan broke it. Assisting how, sir? He asked, not quite hiding the smirk in his voice. Bringing us coffee? A few recruits laughed nervously, unsure if they were allowed to. Reynolds' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Watch your tone, Caldwell. No disrespect intended, sir, Ryan said, raising his hands in mock surrender. Just trying to understand the training plan. Emily said nothing. She simply reached into her canvas bag, pulled out a worn notebook, and opened it to a blank page as if the comment hadn't even registered. That silence unsettled Jenna Ruiz more than any insult could have. She had grown up around men like Ryan. The loud ones were rarely the ones you needed to worry about. It was the quiet ones, the ones who didn't bother defending themselves, that made her pay attention. She leaned toward Tommy. You noticed she didn't even blink. So most people get defensive when someone insults them in front of a crowd. She didn't even look up. Maybe she didn't hear him. She heard him, Jenna said quietly. She just didn't think he was worth the energy. Mini-climax, the first test. The morning's evaluation began with a basic marksmanship drill. Targets set at 400 yards across a shallow canyon, wind gusting unpredictably off the canyon walls. Reynolds called recruits up 2 at a time to demonstrate their long-range accuracy under pressure, while instructors called out variables meant to throw off their concentration. Ryan volunteered to go first, of course. He walked to the firing line with the kind of swagger that made even the instructors exchange a glance. He dropped into position, adjusted his scope, and settled his breathing the way he'd been trained. Behind him, Emily stood near the spotting scope, notebook in hand, watching without a word. Winds picking up from the northwest, called Master Sergeant Dale Whitfield, the range safety officer, a grizzled man who had seen every kind of recruit ego walk through this facility. Adjust accordingly. Ryan made his calculation. He was good, genuinely good, and he knew it. His first shot landed close to center mass. Nice, Tommy said. Watch and learn, Ryan replied, already lining up his second shot. That was when Emily spoke for the first time all morning. Your wind varad is off by 6 degrees, she said, her voice calm, almost bored. The canyon wall behind the target is bending the crosswind back on itself. If you fire like that, you'll drift left of your mark. Ryan didn't even turn his head. I've got this. I'm sure you do, Emily said, and went back to writing in her notebook. He fired. The bullet struck low and left a center, a clean miss on anything resembling a kill zone. The range went quiet. Ryan blinked at his own scope like it had personally betrayed him. Equipment's off, he muttered. Somebody adjusted my sight. Nobody touched your rifle, Caldwell, Whitfield said flatly. Then it's the wind reading on the board, it's outdated. The wind reading is accurate, Emily said, still not looking up from her notes. You just didn't listen to it. A few recruits exchanged glances. Nobody laughed this time. Ryan's ears went red. He reset, adjusted, fired again. This time he tried to overcorrect for what she'd said more out of stubborn pride than genuine recalculation. The second shot missed even worse. This is ridiculous, he snapped, standing up from the firing position. This isn't a fair evaluation. There's crosswind interference from that canyon that isn't in any manual. There's crosswind interference in every manual that matters, Emily said. You just haven't read the right one yet. The recruits who had been laughing an hour earlier were very quiet now. Mini-climax, a second voice rises. Jenna Ruiz was next on the line. She knelt into position, glanced once at Emily, and made a decision that surprised even herself. Ma'am, she said quietly, what's the actual adjustment for the wind? Ryan scoffed from behind her. Ruiz, don't tell me you're taking marksmanship advice from the coffee lady. Shut up, Ryan, Jenna said without turning around. Emily studied Jenna for a moment as if deciding whether the question was sincere. Then she answered, 6 degrees right of your natural read. Trust the number, not the feeling. The wind will feel like it's coming from due west because of how the canyon funnels it, but it's actually drifting northwest at the target. Compensate for where it's going, not where it feels like it's coming from. Jenna adjusted. She fired. Dead center. The range instructor let out a low whistle. Well, look at that. Jenna sat back from her position, staring at her own target in mild disbelief. She turned to look at Emily, who had already gone back to her notebook, like nothing remarkable had happened at all. How did you know that? Jenna asked. Nobody's supposed to know the wind pattern in this specific canyon. It's not standard. I've stood on this range before, Emily said simply. When Emily didn't answer, she simply turned the page in her notebook and wrote something down. Behind them, Ryan Caldwell stood with his arms crossed, watching the exchange with a tight jaw. He didn't like the way the range had gone quiet around her. He didn't like the way one perfect shot from Jenna had suddenly made the tired woman in the torn jacket seem less ridiculous than she had an hour ago. He didn't like feeling small. And Ryan Caldwell was the kind of man who, when he felt small, tried to make someone else feel smaller. Mini-climax, the whisper spreads. During the break, while recruits refilled canteens and checked their gear, a murmur began working its way down the line. "Did you see that?" one recruit asked another. She called the wind pattern before Ruiz even asked for it. Lucky guess. Twice. Tommy Briggs found himself standing near Whitfield, the range safety officer, who was quietly watching Emily from a distance while pretending to check his equipment log. "Sergeant," Tommy said. "Who is she?" "Really?" Whitfield didn't answer right away. He glanced sideways to make sure Emily was out of earshot before speaking. "You ever hear the name Silent Ghost?" he asked. Tommy frowned. "Like the call sign from the old stories the instructors tell. It's not a story, kid." "Come on, Sergeant. Everybody knows Silent Ghost is just something instructors made up to scare recruits straight. Nobody's ever confirmed who that actually was." Whitfield's expression didn't change. "That's because the Navy never confirmed it. Doesn't mean it isn't true." Tommy felt something cold settle in his stomach. "You're not saying—" "I'm not saying anything," Whitfield said, cutting him off. "I never said a word. You didn't hear anything from me." He walked away before Tommy could ask another question, leaving the young recruit standing there, staring at the woman in the torn jacket like he was seeing her for the first time. Tommy found Jenna a few minutes later and repeated what he'd heard word for word. Jenna's reaction wasn't excitement. It was something closer to unease. "If that's true," she said slowly, "then everything Ryan's been doing all morning is a lot more embarrassing than he realizes." "You think it's true?" "I think," Jenna said, watching Emily calmly clean her spotting scope lens with the corner of her sleeve, "that a woman who calls a canyon wind pattern from memory isn't someone who wandered in off the street." Mini-climax, Ryan doubles down. Word of the whispers eventually reached Ryan the way rumors always find their way to the person they'll bother the most. "Silent Ghost," he repeated, almost laughing. "You've got to be kidding me. That's a campfire story. Every single training class hears some version of it. It changes every time. Sometimes it's a sniper. Sometimes it's a whole team. Sometimes it's a guy who took out 50 tangos with one bullet through a keyhole. It's not real. It's a legend instructors use to keep recruits humble." "Maybe," Tommy said. "Or maybe it's real and it's her." "It's not her," Ryan snapped. "Look at her, Tommy. She's tired. She's older. Her jacket looks like it's survived a shredder. If she was really some legendary operator, she wouldn't be standing here babysitting recruits on a training range in the middle of nowhere. She'd be doing something that actually mattered." "Maybe this matters to her," Jenna said, overhearing. Ryan turned to her, irritation flashing across his face. "You're actually buying this. I'm saying I watched her call 2 separate wind adjustments with zero hesitation on a canyon that isn't standard in any manual we've studied. I'm saying that's not nothing. It's a coincidence." "It's not a coincidence, Ryan." "Fine," Ryan said, his voice rising just enough for a few nearby recruits to turn their heads. "Then let's prove it. Right now, let's see if the coffee lady in the torn jacket can actually shoot, or if she's just really good at reading a chalkboard." Mini-climax. The challenge is issued. Ryan Caldwell marched across the range toward Emily Chin. Up shoulder squared the confidence of a man who had never once considered the possibility that he might be wrong. "Ma'am," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "since you seem to know so much about wind and canyons and long-range shots, how about you show us instead of just talking about it?" Emily looked up from her notebook slowly. "Is that a request or a challenge, Caldwell? Call it whatever you want." Captain Reynolds, standing near the command tent, took a step forward like he was about to intervene, then stopped himself. He had run this evaluation long enough to know when to let a lesson happen on its own. 800 yards, Ryan said, pointing toward a distant steel target barely visible against the canyon rock. "Moving crosswind, uneven elevation, and light so bad, even our best shooters have been struggling with it all morning. If you can hit that target, I'll admit I was wrong about you. If you can't," he shrugged, the smirk returning to his face, "then maybe you should stick to the notebook." A few recruits laughed, though the laughter felt thinner now, less certain than it had that morning. Emily set her notebook down slowly. She looked at the distant target, then at Ryan, then at the small crowd of recruits who had gone quiet around them. 800 yards, she repeated. Too far, Ryan asked, unable to resist one more jab. No, Emily said, just far enough to matter. She reached for the rifle resting near the equipment table, checked it with practiced hands that moved faster and more precisely than anyone expected, and walked toward the firing line without another word. Mini climax. Silence before the shot, the range fell into a hush that felt different from the earlier silences of the day. This wasn't the quiet of boredom or nervousness. This was the specific electric silence of people who suddenly weren't sure what they were about to witness. Emily knelt into position. Her movements were economical, unhurried, the kind of muscle memory that couldn't be faked by someone who had only read about it in a manual. She adjusted the rifle against her shoulder, and as she did, the torn sleeve of her jacket rode up slightly, revealing a thin line of scar tissue along her forearm. Jenna noticed it. She didn't say anything, but she noticed. Whitfield, standing near the spotting scope, called out the wind conditions in a voice that had gone slightly quieter than his usual booming range instructions. Gusting 12 to 18 variable canyon deflection active. Emily didn't respond. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere none of them could follow her, calculating variables that existed only in the space between her eye and the target 800 yards away. Ryan crossed his arms, trying to look unbothered, though his foot had started tapping against the dirt in a rhythm he probably didn't even realize he was doing. Any day now, he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bite. Emily exhaled and fired. Mini climaxed the impossible shot. The steel target 800 yards away rang out with a sound that echoed off the canyon walls, a clean, unmistakable hit dead center. Nobody spoke for a full 3 seconds. Then Whitfield, staring through the spotting scope, said the only thing he could manage. Dead center. Dead center. The recruits erupted into a mixture of gasps and disbelieving murmurs. Tommy Briggs actually took a step backward, like he needed the physical distance to process what he'd just seen. Jenna Ruiz stood completely still, staring at Emily with an expression that had shifted entirely from curiosity to something closer to awe. Ryan Caldwell said nothing at all. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The confident smirk that had lived on his face since sunrise had vanished, completely replaced by something raw and uncertain that he clearly wasn't used to feeling. Emily stood up slowly from the firing position, handed the rifle back to Whitfield without a word, and looked at Ryan with an expression that held no triumph in it at all. No gloating, no satisfaction, just quiet patience, like a teacher waiting for a student to finally understand a lesson that had been staring him in the face all along. You were right about one thing, she said. The light was bad. That's it, Ryan finally managed. That's all you have to say. You just hit an 800-yard shot in bad light with crosswind through a canyon, and all you say is the light was bad. What else is there to say? How bad are you not? Ryan said, his voice cracking slightly. How did you do that? Emily studied him for a long moment. Because I've done it before, she said, under conditions a lot worse than this, with a lot more than a steel target riding it on it. Minnie climaxed the question. Nobody wants to ask. The recruits had gathered closer now, forming a loose semicircle around the firing line, all pretense of training discipline momentarily forgotten. Even Captain Reynolds had walked closer, though his expression remained carefully neutral, the look of a man who already knew the answer to a question that was about to be asked. What conditions? Jenna asked quietly. What are you talking about? Emily didn't answer immediately. She looked out at the canyon, at the distant steel target, still ringing faintly with the echo of impact, and something passed behind her eyes that none of the recruits could name, but all of them recognized as weight. The kind of weight that only comes from carrying something for a very long time. You want to know who I am, she said finally. It wasn't a question. Nobody answered it because nobody trusted their own voice in that moment. I've heard the rumors, she continued. I heard them the second I walked onto this range this morning. I heard the laughing. I heard the jokes about my jacket. Her gaze moved briefly to Ryan. I heard all of it. Ryan's face flushed red, but for the first time all day, he didn't have a comeback ready. I didn't correct any of it, Emily said, because I wasn't here to defend myself. I was here to see who you all really are when you think nobody important is watching. Tommy swallowed hard. And what did you see? Emily's eyes moved slowly down the line, resting for a moment on each face, cataloging something none of them could quite understand. I saw exactly what I expected to see, she said. Talented people who haven't been humbled yet. That's not an insult, it's just a fact. Talent without humility gets people killed. And I've buried enough people to know the difference between the two. The words landed heavier than anything she'd said all day. Mini climax. Ryan's breaking point. Ryan Caldwell, still reeling from the shot he'd just witnessed, seemed to grasp at his pride like a drowning man grasping at driftwood. With all due respect, he said, though his voice shook slightly, one good shot doesn't prove anything. Anyone can get lucky. Whitfield actually laughed out loud at that, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound. Caldwell, I've been running this range for 11 years. I have never, not once, seen a shot like that. Not from an instructor, not from a graduating class honor student, not from anybody. Then it's a fluke, Ryan insisted, though even he seemed to hear how hollow the words sounded coming out of his mouth. Emily didn't argue with him. She simply reached for her canvas bag, and for a moment everyone thought the confrontation was over, that she would simply walk away and let his stubbornness stand uncorrected. Instead, she set the bag down, and she began removing her jacket, mini-climax the scars. The recruits went dead silent as Emily unzipped the worn-torn fabric, slowly, methodically, without any sense of drama or performance. She wasn't doing this for effect. She was doing it because words had clearly stopped being enough. As the jacket slid off her shoulders, the sleeves of her undershirt rode up just enough to reveal what had been hidden beneath the torn fabric all morning. Scar tissue traced along her left forearm in a pattern that told its own violent history, a puckered burn scar near her elbow, a thin surgical line along her shoulder that had clearly required extensive reconstruction at some point in her life. Nobody said a word. Nobody dared to. "You want to know if I'm real?" Emily said quietly, her voice carrying easily across the silent range. "You want to know if the name you've been whispering behind my back all morning actually belongs to a real person, or if it's just a story instructors use to scare recruits?" She let the jacket fall to the dirt at her feet, and there on her upper shoulder, visible now for the first time, was a tattoo that made Master Sergeant Dale Whitfield's face go pale. A Navy SEAL trident wrapped around the silhouette of a sniper rifle surrounded by a ring of small symbols that none of the recruits recognized, but that Whitfield clearly did, because his hand actually rose to his mouth for a brief second before he caught himself. "That insignia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that's not standard issue. That's not something you get for completing training. That's—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Say it," Emily said calmly. "You clearly already know what it means." Whitfield swallowed hard. "That's a unit marking from a classified task force. I've only ever seen it once before in a briefing that got pulled from records 18 months later, like it never happened." Mini-climax, the name finally spoken. Jenna Ruiz was the one who finally said it out loud, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of the realization settling over her. "Silent Ghost," she said. "That's really you, isn't it?" Emily looked at her for a long moment before answering. "That was a name other people gave me," she said. "I never called myself that. I never wanted a name at all. I just wanted to bring my people home." The words hit the range like a physical force. Ryan Caldwell, who had spent the entire morning tearing this woman down with every insult he could think of, stood frozen, staring at the scars on her arm and the tattoo on her shoulder like he was seeing the ground shift beneath his own feet. "You're saying," he said slowly, "that you're actually—" "I'm saying," Emily interrupted calmly, reaching down to pick her torn jacket back up off the ground, "that this jacket you all laughed at this morning has been through things that would have broken every single one of you standing here." She held it up slightly, running her thumb over the rough patch stitched into the damaged sleeve. "This tear," she said quietly, "happened during an operation most of you will never read about in any official record because it was never supposed to exist in the first place. I kept this jacket because it reminds me of the exact moment I almost lost everything. Not because it looks impressive, because it's honest." Ryan opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to find a single word adequate for the moment. Tommy Briggs, still visibly shaken, finally broke the silence with the question that had clearly been building in the back of every recruit's mind since Whitfield had first mentioned the name. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "During that operation. What actually happened to you?" Emily's eyes drifted somewhere distant, somewhere none of them could follow, somewhere that clearly still lived vividly behind her calm exterior, even now, years later. "That," she said slowly, "is not a story I tell on a training range in the middle of a morning drill. Please, Jenna said. I think we need to hear it. I think we need to understand what we almost mocked without even knowing it. Mini-climax, the wait settles. Captain Reynolds finally stepped forward, breaking his long silence, his expression grave in a way none of the recruits had seen from him before. Senior Chief Carter's record is classified for reasons that go well beyond this training facility, he said. But I will tell you this much. Everything you think you know about courage, about sacrifice, about what it actually costs to bring people home alive, you're about to learn it doesn't come close to the real thing. He looked directly at Ryan Caldwell. You spent this entire morning mocking a torn jacket, Reynolds said. You should be asking yourself, what kind of person survives whatever it takes to earn scars like that and still chooses to wear the evidence instead of hiding it? Ryan's throat worked visibly as he swallowed. For the first time since the recruits had gathered on that range at dawn, he looked genuinely completely humbled. Ma'am, he said quietly, his voice barely recognizable from the arrogant tone he'd used just an hour earlier. I'm sorry, I had no idea. I never should have said any of that. Emily studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression softened just slightly, though the weight behind her eyes never fully lifted. I don't need your apology, Caldwell, she said. I need you to understand something more important than that. What's that? The people who deserve respect the least are usually the ones demanding it the loudest, she said. And the people who've actually earned it are usually the ones you'll never hear brag about it at all. The range remained completely silent, every recruit standing frozen in place, absorbing a lesson that no manual, no instructor, no classroom briefing could have ever taught them the way this single morning just had. Emily slowly pulled a torn jacket back over her shoulders, covering the scars and the tattoo, once more hiding away the evidence of a past none of them could fully comprehend. You want to know what happened to me? She said quietly, looking out at the canyon, where her impossible shot still echoed faintly in everyone's memory. You want to know how a torn jacket and a pair of scarred arms ended up standing in front of a group of recruits who thought they already knew everything worth knowing? She paused, and in that pause, every single person on that range leaned in without even realizing they were doing it. It started on a night none of you would have survived, she said, in a place most of you will never hear about in any official record, with a team of good people counting on someone they never should have had to count on. Her eyes drifted toward the horizon, toward a memory that clearly still lived as vividly in her mind as the moment it happened. It started, she said quietly, with a storm that shouldn't have mattered and a mistake that almost cost everyone their lives. The recruit stood in complete silence waiting, and for the first time since she had walked onto that range that morning, wearing nothing but a torn jacket and a quiet, unreadable expression, every single one of them finally understood. They weren't looking at someone weak. They had never been looking at someone weak. They had simply been too arrogant to recognize strength when it was standing right in front of them the entire time. The wind on the range had gone still, as if even the desert itself were leaning in to listen. Every recruit stood frozen where they were, boots planted in the dirt, eyes locked on the woman who had just proven in a single impossible shot that everything they thought they understood about strength was wrong. Emily Carter held her torn jacket closed at the collar with one scarred hand, and for a long moment she simply looked past all of them toward the canyon, toward a memory none of them could see, but all of them could feel pressing against the silence. You want the truth, she said quietly, not the version instructors whisper to scare recruits straight. The real one. Nobody answered. Nobody trusted themselves to. Then sit down, she said, because this isn't a story I tell standing up. They sat. 20-some recruits, hardened Rangers and reconnaissance Marines and Navy candidates, who an hour earlier had been laughing at a torn jacket, lowered themselves into the dirt like children at story time, because in that moment that was exactly what they were. Captain Reynolds didn't stop them. He simply folded his arms and stood at the edge of the group, listening like he already knew the story and needed to hear it again anyway. 3 years ago, Emily said, I was attached to a joint task force operating out of a forward position in northern Syria. Nobody back home knew the base existed. Officially, it still doesn't. Ryan Caldwell, still pale from what he'd witnessed, found his voice first. What was the mission? Extraction, Emily said. A man named Colonel James Hartley, an intelligence officer, had been captured during a reconnaissance operation that went bad 3 weeks earlier. Bad intel, wrong coordinates, and ambush nobody saw coming. He'd been held by an extremist network operating out of a compound near the Turkish border. We had 48 hours of actionable intelligence telling us exactly where he was being kept and a narrow window before they planned to move him somewhere we'd never find him again. 48 hours, Jenna repeated. That's nothing. It was enough, Emily said, if everything went right. She paused and something tightened behind her eyes. Nothing went right. The team had been small by design. 6 operators on the ground, a helicopter crew on standby 30 miles out, and Emily herself assigned as Overwatch, meaning her job was simple in theory and nearly impossible in practice. Get to high ground, stay invisible, and keep 6 men alive from a position no one was supposed to know existed. Her spotter that night was a young petty officer named Danny Okafor, 24 years old, sharp-eyed, quick with a joke, even in the worst conditions, the kind of partner who made the silence of a long watch bearable. They had worked together for 11 months, by that point long enough to read each other's breathing, long enough that words had become almost unnecessary between them. "You nervous?" Danny had asked her as they climbed the ridgeline in the dark pack's heavy night vision, casting the rocky terrain in cold green light. "Always," Emily said. "Liar." "Fine, sometimes." "That's more believable," Danny said, grinning even as sweat ran down his temple from the climb. Silent ghost showing actual human emotion. "Somebody write this down." "Don't call me that." "Why not everybody else does?" "Because a name like that gets people killed," Emily said. "The second you start believing your own legend, you stop checking your 6. Danny had laughed quietly at that, the sound swallowed by the wind, and they'd kept climbing. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the compound, the moon had dropped low enough to throw long shadows across the valley floor. Emily settled into position behind a jagged outcropping of rock at 1,100 meters from the compound wall, rifle steady, breathing, slow. Danny crouched beside her, with the spotting scope calling range and wind in a whisper barely louder than breath itself. "Teams approaching the south wall," came the voice over her earpiece, low and clipped. That was Marcus Cole, team lead, a broad-shouldered staff sergeant with 15 years in and a reputation for bringing every single one of his people home. "Overwatch, you have eyes on the north gate." "Eyes on where?" Emily whispered back. 2 guards stationary, no movement in the last 10 minutes. "Copy. We're moving in 3, mini-climax." The first wrong note. It was Danny who noticed at first, a small detail that shouldn't have mattered and ended up mattering more than anything else that night. "Emily," he whispered, "guard rotation just changed." "What do you mean changed?" "There were 2 guards on that north gate 10 minutes ago. Now there's 4, and they're not standing like guards anymore. Look at their spacing. Look at how they're holding their weapons." Emily adjusted her scope and her stomach dropped. "They're expecting someone," she said quietly. "You think they know we're coming?" "I think," Emily said, already keying her radio, "that somebody needs to abort right now." "Overwatch, this is Cole. Say again, you're breaking up." "Abort the approach," Emily said, urgency creeping into her whisper despite every instinct telling her to stay calm. "Guard count just doubled at the north gate. Positioning changed. This isn't standard rotation. Marcus, this looks like they're braced for contact." There was a pause on the radio, the kind of pause that felt like it lasted an hour but was really only 3 seconds. "We're already committed." Cole's voice came back tight and low. "We're 40 meters from the wall. Pulling back now creates more exposure than pushing through the original plan. Stand by Overwatch, we're adjusting entry point." Emily's jaw clenched. Danny glanced at her, and even in the dark, she could see the same unease reflected on his face that was tightening in her own chest. "This is going bad," Danny whispered. "Maybe." "You don't sound convinced." "I'm never convinced," Emily said, eye back against her scope. "That's how I stay alive." Mini-climax, the sky turns wrong. It was the wind that betrayed them, first arriving nearly 20 minutes ahead of any forecast the mission planners had reviewed. Emily felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air pressure against her exposed skin, a subtle change in the way sound carried across the valley. "Danny," she said, "check the horizon." He turned his scope westward and went still. "That's not fog." "No," Emily said grimly, "that's a sandstorm." "How fast is it moving?" "Fast enough that we don't have time to argue about it." She keyed her radio again. "Ground team, this is Overwatch. We've got a sandstorm inbound from the west, moving fast. Visibility is about to collapse. You need to move now, or you need to move back, but you can't stay static." The radio crackled with static worse than it had been moments earlier, the storm already beginning to interfere with the signal. Copy Overwatch. Cole's voice came through fractured and thin. We're pushing through the wall now. No time to reposition. Keep eyes on us as long as you can. Marcus, if that storm hits full force, I lose visual on your position entirely. Understood. Do what you can. The line went quiet, replaced by the low building howl of wind sweeping down off the ridge, carrying with it the first stinging grains of sand that bit into Emily's exposed cheeks like tiny needles. Danny pulled his scarf up over his mouth and nose. This is not good. No, Emily agreed, it's not. Within 4 minutes, the world beyond 50 meters had vanished into a churning wall of orange-brown haze. The compound, the wall the 6 men moving through the darkness toward whatever awaited them inside all of it, disappeared into a storm that swallowed sound and sight alike. Mini-climax. Silence on the radio. Ground team, this is Overwatch. Radio check, Emily said, voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. Static. Ground team radio check over. More static than a fragment of a voice broken and distorted almost beyond recognition. Contact wall breach taking fire. Say again, you're cutting out. Nothing. Marcus, say again. The radio gave her nothing but the hiss of interference and the howling wind outside, and for the first time in 11 months of working together, Emily saw genuine fear cross Danny Okafor's face. We just lost them, he said. We haven't lost anyone, Emily snapped sharper than she intended. We lost the signal. There's a difference. Emily, I can't see 15 feet in front of me. How are we supposed to provide Overwatch for a team we can't even see? Emily didn't answer right away because she didn't have an answer that didn't terrify her. Then through the roar of the storm, she heard it, distant, muffled, but unmistakable. Gunfire. Sustained, heavy, the deep mechanical chatter of a crew-served weapon, not the sporadic pop of rifle fire, but something far worse, something that meant the 6 men somewhere below in that blinding storm had just walked directly into exactly what she'd feared. That's a machine gun, Danny said, his voice tight. I know what it is. We have to do something. I know that too, Emily said, already moving, shifting her position along the ridge, trying to find any gap in the storm that might give her a fraction of visibility toward the compound below. Get me anything, Danny. Any break in this haze at all. Mini-climax. A voice returns. The radio cracked back to life so suddenly it made Danny flinch. Overwatch, this is Colt, do you copy? The transmission dissolved into static, then returned. Pinned down, taking heavy fire from a fixed position. We have 1 wounded, I say again, 1 wounded. Copy, Marcus, say your position. Can't confirm, storm's got us turned around. We're behind a low wall, maybe 60 meters from the extraction point, but that gun's got the whole approach locked down. We cannot move. Who's wounded? A pause that felt like it stretched into forever. Hartley, Cole's voice finally came back fractured with strain. We got him out of the holding cell, but he took shrapnel in the leg during the breach. He can't walk. We're carrying him and we're pinned. Overwatch, we need that gun position taken out or none of us are leaving this valley. Emily's blood went cold. Can you give me a location on that weapon? Negative visibility 0 down here. I can hear it, but I can't see it. It's east of our position. That's all I've got. Danny looked at Emily, his face pale beneath the sand-streaked scarf. East of their position. That's it. That's all we have to work with. That's what we have, Emily said already, sliding forward along the outcropping, eyes straining against the storm for any hint of movement, any shift in the color of the haze that might betray a muzzle flash. So that's what we use. Mini-climax the first glimpse. For 3 agonizing minutes, there was nothing but sand and wind and the distant, relentless chatter of that machine gun, punctuated by shorter bursts of return, fire from Cole's team, a losing exchange that Emily could hear getting more desperate with every passing second. Then for just a fraction of a second, the storm parted. It wasn't much, barely 2 seconds of relative clarity in a gap between gusts, but it was enough for Emily to catch the telltale strobe of muzzle flash from a position dug into the rocks nearly 900 meters away at an elevation and angle that made her stomach drop even further than it already had. Danny, I've got a visual. Where? Elevated position, rocky outcrop, probably a natural formation they fortified. That's not a hasty position that's prepared. They knew we were coming. 900 meters in this wind, Danny said, disbelief edging into his voice. Emily, that's not a shot, that's a miracle. It's the only shot we've got. She keyed her to radio again. Marcus, I have a possible visual on the gun position, elevated roughly 900 meters from my location. I need you to confirm bearing from your position so I can cross-reference. Nothing but static answered her. Marcus, do you copy? Still nothing. Marcus. The silence stretched, and Emily felt something close to panic clawing at the edges of her discipline, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself in years. Mini-climax wounded. The radio crackled back with a voice that wasn't Cole's. Overwatch, this is Ferris, came the strained voice of the team's corpsman. Cole's hit, I say again. Cole is hit, took a round through the shoulder, trying to get better position on that gun. Emily's hand tightened around her rifle so hard her knuckles went white. Is he alive? He's alive, he's conscious, but he's losing blood. And we've got 2 wounded now, and that gun isn't slowing down Overwatch. We are running out of time down here. Ferris, I need someone to confirm the gun's exact bearing from your position. Can anyone give me that? A pause filled with the sound of gunfire and wind and someone groaning in pain in the background. Negative, Ferris finally said. Nobody down here can get eyes on it without exposing themselves to direct fire. We're pinned flat Overwatch. We cannot lift our heads. Danny turned to Emily, and for the first time that night, she saw real desperation in his eyes. What do we do? Emily didn't answer immediately. She was staring out at the churning wall of sand and haze that separated her from a shot she could barely see, calculating variables that existed almost entirely in her own memory and instinct now, because the storm had taken away everything else. I go closer, she said finally. What? I move down the ridge closer to that gun position. It's the only way I get a clean enough angle to take the shot blind. Emily, that's insane. You'd be moving directly into a storm with zero visibility toward a position that's already killing our own people. I know what I'd be doing, Danny. They'll see you before you see them. Maybe, Emily said, already checking her gear, already moving. But right now, 6 men are dying in a valley because I'm sitting up here safe, and I am done sitting up here safe. Twist the ridge collapses. She had moved less than 80 meters down the exposed face of the ridge when the ground beneath her right boot gave way, entirely loose shale shifting under the added instability of the wind, sending her sliding nearly 15 feet down a steep incline before she managed to catch herself against an outcropping of rock. Pain exploded through her left ankle, sharp and immediate, and she bit down hard on a scream that would have given away her position to anyone within 100 meters. Emily, Danny's voice crackled through her earpiece, thin with static. Emily, talk to me, what happened? I'm fine, she gritted out, though the fire shooting up her leg told a very different story. Lost my footing, I'm still moving. You don't sound fine. I said I'm fine, Danny. She forced herself upright, testing weight on the ankle, feeling it hold just barely enough to continue, and kept moving through the storm, each step now a negotiation with pain she refused to acknowledge out loud. That was when the explosion happened. It came from somewhere close, terrifyingly close, a concussive blast that ripped through the haze and threw Emily sideways into the rocks, the shockwave tearing through the fabric of her jacket and sending shrapnel tearing into her forearm and shoulder. For a moment, the world went white, then silent, then came rushing back all at once, in a roar of pain and ringing ears and the acrid smell of burnt fabric. Emily, Danny's voice distant and frantic, barely audible over the ringing in her ears. Emily, respond. She lay there for a moment, staring up at the churning brown sky, blood soaking through the torn sleeve of her jacket, and somewhere deep in the pain and confusion, a single clear thought cut through everything else. They're still down there. They're still dying. Get up, mini-climax, refusing to fall back. Danny reached her position less than a minute later, half sliding down the same unstable slope, his face white with fear as he saw the blood soaking through her sleeve. You're hit, he said, already reaching for the medical kit on his belt. I'm fine. Emily, you have shrapnel in your arm. I can see it from here. You need to fall back to the ridge. I'll call for immediate extraction. No, Emily said, pushing herself upright, despite the way her vision swam at the edges. No, Emily, are you insane? You can barely stand. Your ankle's clearly messed up, and now you're bleeding. This is exactly the moment where the mission plan says we fall back to a defensible position and reassess. The mission plan didn't account for 6 men dying in a valley while I sit safely on a ridge nursing a scratch. Emily snapped, her voice sharper than she'd ever used with him before. Danny, listen to me. That gun is still firing, which means our people are still pinned, which means every second we spend arguing about my ankle is a second closer to somebody down there not making it home. Your arm will heal, Emily said. Marcus and the others might not if I don't finish this. Danny stared at her for a long moment, torn between every instinct telling him to protect his partner and the undeniable truth in what she was saying. Finally, jaw tight, he nodded. Then I'm not leaving your side, he said. If you're doing this, I'm calling wind and spotting for you the whole way. And if you go down again, I'm dragging you out myself, understood? Understood, Emily said, and for just a moment, something like gratitude flickered across her pain-tightened features. Now help me up. Wes said blunt. They moved another 60 meters closer, close enough now that the sound of gunfire had become a physical presence vibrating through the ground beneath them, close enough that Emily could feel the storm's edge beginning to thin just slightly, though visibility remained a cruel joke of shifting brown haze. She settled into position behind a low outcropping rifle steady, despite the fire in her injured shoulder, and keyed her radio one final time. Ferris, I need anything. Muzzle flash timing, sound direction, anything at all. Through the static, Ferris's strained voice came back. Flash is intermittent, maybe every 4 seconds. Elevated position, we're estimating 40 meters up from the valley floor, based on the angle of fire hitting our position. That's not a location, Ferris, that's a guess. It's the only guess we've got. Overwatch. We are pinned flat on our stomachs with rounds cracking 6 inches over our heads. This is the best we can give you. Emily closed her eyes for a single second, forcing her breathing to slow, despite the pain screaming through her body, despite the storm howling around her, despite the impossible mathematics of what she was about to attempt. She could not see the target. She could only calculate. The wind gusting unpredictably from the west, then swirling back on itself as it funneled through the narrowing walls of the valley. The elevation Ferris had estimated 40 meters up, factored against the angle her position gave her relative to the compound's known layout from the mission briefing 3 days earlier. Information she had memorized without ever imagining she'd need to recall it, blind under fire, bleeding in a storm that had erased the entire visible world. The timing of the muzzle flash, 4 seconds, meant a specific rate of fire, which meant a specific type of weapon, which meant a specific profile of the person operating it, height likely, stance likely, cover. Emily, Danny said quietly beside her, voice tight with barely controlled fear. You're about to take a shot at a target you cannot see based on secondhand information from a man who's currently getting shot at. If this is wrong, Emily said, settling her cheek against the stock of her rifle, then it was already going to end badly for all of us anyway. At least this way I go down trying. That's not comforting. It's not supposed to be comforting. It's supposed to be true. She exhaled slowly. The pain in her shoulder throbbed with every heartbeat, sand stinging against every inch of exposed skin, the world reduced to nothing but wind and instinct, and 11 months of trust in the young man crouched beside her. Wind shifting, Danny said. His voice had gone completely steady, now all fear pushed down beneath the discipline that had brought him this far. Compensate 2 degrees right of your last calculation. Copy. Flash incoming in 3 seconds. Emily's finger settled against the trigger. Every ounce of pain in her body faded into something distant and irrelevant, replaced entirely by the singular narrowing focus that had made her exactly what the whispers on that training range had called her, a name she never asked for and never wanted, but that had been earned in exactly this kind of impossible, blind, desperate moment. 2 seconds. 1. Flash. Climax. The shot fired blind. Emily fired. The recoil tore through her already wounded shoulder like fire, and for a fraction of a second the world went silent, except for the ringing in her ears and the desperate pounding of her own heart. Then through the storm came a sound that changed everything. The machine gun stopped. Not a pause in the rhythm of fire, not a reload, but a complete, total, permanent silence, where seconds earlier there had been nothing but relentless mechanical death raining down on 6 men trapped in a valley. Overwatch? Ferris's voice crackled through the radio, disbelief evident in every syllable. Overwatch, the gun's down. I say again, the gun position is down. We have movement. We're moving. We're moving now. Danny let out a shaking breath beside her. You did it. Emily, you actually did it. Emily didn't answer right away. She was staring out into the churning haze where a shot she couldn't see had somehow found exactly what it needed to find, and something in her chest that had been coiled tight with fear for the last 20 minutes finally slowly began to release. Get them moving, she said, her voice hoarse. Get them to the extraction point. Now before that storm gives them another window to send someone else to that gun. Mini-climax the extraction. What followed happened in fragments pieced together later from radio traffic and after-action reports that Emily herself would never fully read, because by the time the helicopter finally cut through the thinning storm to the extraction point, blood loss and exhaustion had pulled her down into a darkness she barely fought against. She remembered Danny's hands pressing against her shoulder, trying to slow the bleeding. She remembered Marcus Cole's voice, weak but alive, saying her name over and over like a question he needed answered. She remembered the weight of Colonel Hartley being loaded onto the helicopter beside her, his leg wrapped in field dressings, his face pale but his eyes locked on hers with an expression she would never quite be able to describe to anyone who hadn't been there. "You're the one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as the helicopter lifted off into the retreating storm. "You're the one who took that shot." "Rest, sir," Emily managed. "We'll talk later." "I need you to know," Hartley said, gripping her hand with more strength than his condition should have allowed. "I have a wife, 2 daughters. I was not supposed to see them again. You understand that I was not supposed to walk off that valley floor." Emily didn't answer. She simply held his hand until the darkness finally took her under. What she never knew. She woke up 2 days later in a field hospital. Her shoulder stitched and bandaged, her ankle wrapped, IV lines running into both arms, and Danny Okafor, asleep in a chair beside her bed, still wearing the same sand-streaked uniform from that night, refusing to leave despite 3 separate orders from medical staff to go rest. "You're an idiot," she rasped her first words in 2 days. Danny jolted awake, and the relief that broke across his face was almost enough to make her forget how much everything hurt. "You're one to talk," he said, voice cracking slightly. "You took a blind shot at 900 meters in a sandstorm with shrapnel in your arm. I think idiot might actually be an understatement for what you did. Did everyone make it?" Danny's expression sobered slightly. "Cole's stable. Shoulder wound, he'll recover fully, already complaining about missing 3 weeks of active duty. 2 other guys took minor wounds, nothing life-threatening. And Hartley," he paused. "Hartley's already been debriefed, already flown out to reunite with his family. He asked about you before he left. Wanted your name. You didn't give it to him." "Of course I didn't," Danny said. "But I don't think it matters. Word's already spreading, Emily. What you did out there, blind shot, storm wounded, saving 6 men and a hostage, nobody thought was coming home. People are going to talk about this, whether you want them to or not." Emily closed her eyes, the weight of everything finally settling over her, now that the adrenaline and danger had faded into simple, exhausted reality. "I didn't do it for the story," she said quietly. "I know," Danny said. "That's exactly why it's going to become one anyway." Mini-climax the torn jacket. It was 3 weeks later, back at the base, recovering restless, when Emily finally asked for her gear to be returned to her, including the jacket she'd been wearing that night, torn open at the shoulder from the shrapnel that had nearly ended everything. The quartermaster had looked at her strangely when she requested it back, instead of accepting the standard replacement issued to every wounded operator. "This one's damaged beyond repair, ma'am," he'd said. "Regulation says we issue you a new one." "I don't want a new one," Emily had said. "I want this one." "Can I ask why he showed?" Emily had looked down at the torn fabric in her hands, at the burn mark along the sleeve, at the tear that would need careful stitching to ever be wearable again, and something in her chest had settled into a decision she would carry with her for years afterward. "Because new jackets don't remember anything," she said. "This one does." She had stitched it herself that night, rough, imperfect thread work that would never win any admiration for craftsmanship, but that held the fabric together in a way that felt to her more honest than anything a factory could have produced. Every tear told her something. Every rough patch reminded her of a moment where she had chosen to stay instead of retreat, to push forward instead of fall back, to trust her own calculations, even when the world had gone completely blind around her. She wore that jacket for 3 more years, through 2 more classified operations that would never appear in any public record, through promotions she quietly accepted and recognition she consistently avoided, until the day Captain Michael Reynolds had called her personally and asked if she would consider one final assignment before her transition to a training role. "I need someone to run character evaluations for the incoming class," he'd told her over the phone. "Not skill evaluations. We've got plenty of instructors who can test whether these recruits can shoot straight and run fast. I need someone who can test who they actually are underneath all that talent before it's too late to fix what's broken." "Why me?" Because you're the only person I know, Reynolds had said, who understands the difference between confidence and character better than anyone else in this entire organization. And because I think some of these recruits need to learn that lesson from someone who's actually paid the price for skipping it, cliffhanger by to the present. The memory faded and Emily blinked, returning to the present, to the training range in Arizona, to the semicircle of recruits sitting in stunned silence, around her every single face marked by the same slow dawning understanding. Ryan Caldwell sat frozen, staring at the scars visible along her forearm, where the sleeve had ridden up during her story, staring at the torn jacket now draped back over her shoulders, and something in his expression had shifted entirely from the arrogant confidence of that morning into something raw and humbled, and genuinely afraid of what he'd almost done with his careless mockery. "That jacket," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "the one I laughed at this morning." "Is the same one," Emily confirmed quietly. "You've worn it for 3 years, through everything since then." "I'll wear it until it finally falls apart completely," Emily said, "because every time I put it on, it reminds me of the exact moment I almost gave up and the exact moment I chose not to." Jenna Ruiz wiped at her eyes, not bothering to hide the tears that had gathered there during the last 20 minutes of Emily's story. "What happened to Danny, your spotter?" Something flickered across Emily's face, quick and painful, gone, almost before anyone could fully register it. "That," she said quietly, "is a different story. One I'm not ready to tell today." The recruits exchanged uncertain glances, sensing the weight behind those words, sensing that whatever had happened to the young petty officer, who had refused to leave her side that night in the storm, carried a grief that ran even deeper than the scars she'd already shown them. Captain Reynolds cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the range. "I think," he said slowly, "that's enough for today's history lesson, but I don't think any of you will forget it." Ryan Caldwell rose slowly to his feet, and for the first time since dawn that morning, when he'd stood in front of his teammates, laughing about a torn jacket and a broken old woman, his entire posture had changed. Shoulders lowered, chin down, every trace of arrogance replaced by something that looked remarkably like genuine respect. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I owe you more than an apology." Emily studied him for a long moment, the tired weight behind her eyes never quite lifting, but something in her expression softened just slightly at the sight of a man finally truly humbled. "You owe me nothing, Caldwell," she said, "but you owe every person you'll ever serve, beside the promise that you'll never again mistake someone's silence for weakness." She reached down, picked up her canvas bag, and slung it back over her shoulder, wincing slightly as the movement pulled against old scar tissue that still, even now, occasionally reminded her of that night in the storm. "Because the next time you underestimate someone," she said, looking out at the entire silent formation, "it might not be a training range where the mistake gets corrected. It might be a battlefield. And on a battlefield, that kind of mistake doesn't just embarrass you." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle fully over every single recruit still sitting frozen in the dirt. "It gets people killed." Nobody moved for a long moment after Emily's words settled over the range. The recruits sat in the dirt, staring at her, at the jacket, at the scars they now understood carried a story none of them would ever forget. Then Tommy Briggs, still wiping at his eyes, asked the question that had been hanging in the air since she'd first mentioned his name. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "you said Danny's story was different, that you weren't ready to tell it today." Emily went very still. "I did say that." "Is he—" Tommy hesitated. "Is he still in the service? Did he make it out okay?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that Jenna reached over and put a hand on Tommy's arm, a silent signal to stop pushing. But Emily raised her hand slightly, a small gesture that told Jenna it was fine, that the question deserved an answer, even if the answer wasn't easy to give. "Danny Okafor," Emily said slowly, "served 2 more years after that night in the storm. He made staff sergeant. He trained 6 more classes of spotters, every one of them better than the last because he insisted on it. He used to tell them the same thing I'm telling you now. That confidence without humility gets people killed." She paused and something in her throat visibly tightened. "He died 18 months ago," she said. "Not in combat, not overseas. A car accident 2 miles from his own house, driving home from his daughter's school recital." The words hit the range like a physical blow. Jenna's hand flew to her mouth. Ryan Caldwell, still sitting in the dirt where he'd lowered himself to listen, looked like he'd been struck. After everything he survived, Ryan said quietly, almost to himself. After the storm, the gunfire, all of it. And then, and then, Emily said, the world reminded all of us that it doesn't care how brave you were yesterday. It only cares whether you're paying attention today. Mini climax, the weight of memory. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his voice quieter than the recruits had heard it all morning. Senior Chief Carter attended that funeral in dress uniform, he said. Stood at attention for 2 hours in the rain because she refused to sit under the tent with everyone else. Told me afterward that Danny never once complained about hard weather in 11 months on watch together, and she wasn't about to start complaining about it the day they buried him. Emily didn't confirm or deny it. She simply looked down at her jacket at the torn sleeve stitched with rough, imperfect thread and ran her thumb along the seam like she was touching something sacred. I keep this jacket, she said finally, because Danny used to tease me about it. Told me I looked like a homeless person wearing government surplus. Told me I should get a new one that I'd earned better. She almost smiled, though the expression didn't quite reach her eyes. I never got the new one, and now I never will, because every time I put this on, some small, stubborn part of me still expects to hear him laughing about it. Nobody spoke. Nobody could. Jenna finally broke the silence, her voice thick. That's why you're doing this evaluation, isn't it? It's not just about testing us. Emily looked at her, and for the first time all day, something like real emotion crossed her carefully controlled features. Danny used to say the Navy was full of talented people who never got the chance to become good people because nobody stopped long enough to teach them the difference. She said, I couldn't save him from a rainy road 2 miles from his house, but I can still do the thing he spent his whole career doing. I can still try to make sure the next generation doesn't confuse talent for readiness. She stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees, and something in her posture had shifted. The grief folded back down into the same quiet discipline that had carried her through a sandstorm 3 years earlier. Which is why, she said, her voice returning to its calm, level command, we are not finished today. Not even close. Twist, the real evaluation begins. The recruits exchanged uneasy glances as Emily walked toward the equipment staging area. Her limp barely noticeable now, though Jenna had caught her wincing slightly with each step and understood now exactly what that old injury had cost. On your feet, Emily called out. All of you. They scrambled up, adjusting gear, exchanging confused looks. This morning, Emily said, you completed a marksmanship drill under moderate pressure, wind elevation timing constraints, standard evaluation conditions. I want to be very clear about something before we continue. She turned to face the entire formation. That was not the test. Ryan frowned. Ma'am, then what was the test? Emily said, was how you treated the person standing next to you when you thought nobody important was watching. Some of you passed that test hours ago, the moment you offered to help a struggling teammate instead of mocking them. Some of you failed it spectacularly. Her gaze flicked briefly to Ryan, though there was no cruelty in it now. Only the flat honesty of someone stating fact. The good news is failing this morning doesn't mean you're finished. It means you have the rest of today to prove the lesson landed. What happens now? Tommy asked. Now, Emily said, we find out who you become when your body is exhausted, your equipment is heavy, and every easy excuse in the world is telling you to quit. She checked her watch. It's currently 11:40 in the morning, she said. By the time the sun sets tonight, every single one of you is going to know exactly what you're made of. Not what you think you're made of, what you're actually made of. Mini climax, the first drill. The first station waited at the far end of the range, a stretch of open desert marked with irregular obstacles. Sandbags stacked into makeshift barriers, low crawl trenches dug into the hardened earth, and a rope course strung between 2 elevated platforms that shimmered slightly in the rising heat. Full combat load, Whitfield announced, gesturing to a row of heavy rucksacks lined up along the starting point. 65 pounds each. You will complete this course in pairs. Your partner's performance affects your score as much as your own. Ryan reached for the nearest pack, but Emily's voice stopped him. Not that one, she said. Take the one at the end. Ryan frowned but complied, hefting the pack onto his shoulders, and immediately felt something was different. It was heavier, noticeably heavier than the others, the straps digging into his shoulders in a way that made him grunt involuntarily. This one's overloaded, he said. It's 75 pounds, Emily confirmed, 10 pounds heavier than everyone else's. Why? Because this morning you told this entire formation that a woman in a torn jacket wasn't worth their respect. Emily said, her voice carrying no malice, only calm level instruction. I want you to carry that weight today. Literally, see how it feels. Ryan's jaw tightened, but something in Emily's expression told him arguing would accomplish nothing. He nodded once, adjusted the straps, and took his position at the starting line beside Tommy, who had been assigned as his partner for the course. You good? Tommy asked quietly. I will be, Ryan said, though his voice strained slightly under the weight already pressing down on his shoulders. Whitfield raised his hand. On my mark, 3, 2, 1, go. Minnie climaxed the trench. The first obstacle nearly broke Ryan before he'd covered 50 meters. The low crawl trench, barely 2 feet deep, forced every recruit down onto their stomachs, dragging the heavy rucksacks behind them through loose sun-baked dirt that clung to every exposed inch of skin. Ryan's extra 10 pounds dragged against his shoulders with every pull forward, and by the time he emerged from the far end of the trench, his arms were shaking, sweat pouring down his face despite the relatively mild morning heat. Keep moving, Emily called from the sidelines, walking alongside the course, with her notebook tucked under one arm, watching everything. The next obstacle doesn't care that the last one hurt. Jenna, paired with a quiet Marine candidate named Sarah Kowalski, moved through the trench with practiced efficiency. Years of reconnaissance training, giving her an economy of motion that made the obstacle look almost easy. She emerged ahead of most of the formation, glanced back and saw Ryan still struggling, several meters behind. Go on without me, Dara said, noticing Jenna's hesitation. We're a team, Jenna said. I'm not leaving you. I'm fine, Ruiz, seriously. I know you're fine, Jenna said. That's not the point. Mini climax, the rope course. The rope obstacle loomed next, 2 elevated platforms connected by a taut length of thick rope that recruits had to traverse, hand over hand, packs still strapped to their backs 40 feet above a sand pit that offered little comfort if a grip failed. Tommy Briggs stared up at it, his throat visibly tightening. You've done this before, Ryan said, noticing his partner's hesitation, despite his own exhaustion. Not with 70 pounds of gear and arms that already feel like jello, Tommy admitted. Yeah, well. Ryan managed a tired, genuine smile, something rare and unguarded crossing his face. Neither have I. Come on, we go together. They climbed the platform side by side, and Ryan, despite his own burning shoulders and the extra weight Emily had assigned him as a lesson, found himself talking Tommy through each handhold, each shift in balance, in a voice far more patient than anything he'd used all morning. Don't look down, Ryan said. Look at the next hold. Just the next one. Not the whole rope, just the next hold. That's oddly good advice, Tommy said, sweat dripping from his chin as he inched forward. My old man used to say something like that, Ryan admitted. Before every hard thing, focus on the next step, not the whole mountain. I used to think it was corny. And now I think maybe I should have listened to him more. They reached the far platform together, breathing hard, arms trembling, but both of them made it, and something in the exchange had shifted between them. A quiet camaraderie built not from talent, but from struggle shared honestly. Below, Emily watched the exchange with an expression that, for just a moment, looked almost like approval. Cliffhanger, a voice from command. The radio clipped to Captain Reynolds' vest crackled sharply, cutting through the ambient noise of recruits struggling through obstacles. He stepped away from the course, pressing the device to his ear, and his expression shifted from mild interest to something far more serious within seconds. Say again, he said into the radio, his voice suddenly tight. Whitfield noticed, first glancing toward his commanding officer with obvious concern. Emily, 20 meters away, noticed the shift in Reynolds' posture. Almost immediately, years of instinct honed on far more dangerous ground than a training range, picking up on the subtle signs of urgent news. Reynolds ended the call and stood still for a moment, processing whatever he'd just heard before turning to look directly at Emily across the training range. She held his gaze, and something passed between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Continue the drill, Reynolds called out to Whitfield. I need Senior Chief Carter for a moment. Emily crossed the distance between them without hurrying, though every recruit who happened to glance her way noticed the shift in her posture, the sudden alertness that replaced the calm, patient instructor from moments earlier. What is it? She said quietly once she was close enough that the recruits couldn't overhear. That was Fleet Command, Reynolds said, his voice low. You need to hear this directly, not secondhand. Mini-climax overheard fragments. Tommy Briggs, still catching his breath at the base of the rope platform, happened to glance toward the command tent and noticed the tense conversation unfolding between Reynolds and Emily. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read body language well enough to know something serious was happening. "Hey," he said, nudging Ryan. "Something's going on." Ryan followed his gaze. Emily's posture had gone rigid, her arms crossed tightly, her expression, even from this distance, unmistakably grim. "You think it's bad news?" Ryan asked. "I think," Tommy said slowly, "that whatever just happened, it's not about us anymore." Jenna joined them, wiping sweat from her forehead, watching the same tense exchange. She just went from calm instructor to someone bracing for impact. "I've seen that look before. My older brother does search and rescue. That's the face people make right before they get sent somewhere they don't want to go." The three of them stood together, watching from a distance. The training drill, momentarily forgotten as something far more consequential, seemed to unfold 30 meters away. Twist the news. Reynolds kept his voice low, but Emily's sharp intake of breath was audible, even from where the recruit stood watching. "When?" she asked. 6 hours ago, Reynolds said. Communication went dark during what should have been a routine humanitarian security detail. 4-person team embedded with an NGO medical convoy in a contested region. Last transmission indicated they were taking small arms fire and moving to a fallback position. Nothing since. Emily's jaw tightened. Location. "Classified beyond this conversation," Reynolds said. "But you know the region. You've operated there before. Who's the team lead?" Reynolds hesitated, and something in that hesitation made Emily's stomach drop before he even said the name. "Marcus Cole," he said quietly. Mini-climax, the ghost return. For a long moment, Emily said nothing at all. The name hung in the air between them, heavy with 3 years of history, with a night in a sandstorm with a wounded staff sergeant she had once saved with a blind shot fired through a wall of sand and chaos. "Marcus retired 18 months ago," she finally said. "He took a security contracting position. Told me it was supposed to be safer than active duty." "It was supposed to be," Reynolds said grimly, "until it wasn't." "Who else is on the team?" 3 contractors, former special operations, all vetted, all experienced. "But Emily, this isn't a straightforward extraction. The region's grown more volatile in the last 6 months. Whoever goes in after them needs someone who understands the terrain, the local factions, the exact kind of chaos that swallowed your team 3 years ago." Emily's eyes drifted unfocused toward the recruits, still standing near the rope course watching this conversation unfold with barely concealed anxiety. "You're asking me to go back," she said quietly. "I'm telling you," Reynolds said, "that Fleet Command specifically requested your involvement in planning the recovery operation. Your operational knowledge of that region is irreplaceable. But there is something else." "What else could there possibly be?" Reynolds hesitated again, and this time when he spoke, his voice carried a different kind of weight entirely. "They're not just asking for your planning expertise," he said. "They're asking whether you'd consider joining the recovery team directly. Field capacity, Overwatch position, same as before. Cliffhanger, the decision." Emily stood completely still, the desert wind tugging gently at the torn sleeve of her jacket, her mind clearly racing through calculations that had nothing to do with wind speed or elevation. "I haven't been in an active field role in over a year," she said slowly. "I'm aware. I have an ankle that still aches every time weather changes, a shoulder that hasn't fully recovered its range of motion. I'm not the same operator I was 3 years ago, Michael." "Nobody's asking you to be," Reynolds said. "They're asking whether you're willing to try anyway. Marcus Cole is out there somewhere in trouble with 3 other people counting on someone to come find them. And as far as Fleet Command is concerned, there's exactly 1 person alive who's already proven she can pull impossible shots out of impossible situations in that exact region." Emily looked past him toward the recruits, toward Ryan Caldwell, and Jenna Ruiz and Tommy Briggs, all of them, watching this exchange with expressions caught somewhere between confusion and dawning understanding that something much larger than their training evaluation had just entered the range. "Give me an hour," she said finally. "I need to finish something here first." Mini-climax returned to the recruits. Emily walked back toward the formation, her expression carefully composed despite the storm clearly churning behind her eyes. The recruits fell silent as she approached, sensing immediately that whatever conversation had just occurred carried weight far beyond their training exercise. "Ma'am," Jenna said carefully, "is everything all right?" Emily considered the question for a long moment before answering. No, she said honestly, it's not, but that's not something any of you need to carry today. Was that about a real mission? Tommy asked, unable to help himself. Emily's silence was answer enough. The man who saved your life, Ryan said slowly, piecing something together. Marcus, the team leader from the story, is he? I'm not going to discuss operational details with recruits, Emily said, though her voice carried none of the sharpness the words might have suggested. What I will tell you is this. Everything I've spent today teaching you about character, about humility, about the difference between confidence and readiness, all of it exists because moments like the one I just walked away from happen more often than any of you realize. People you love end up in situations where the only thing standing between them and disaster is whether the person coming to help them actually learned the lessons that matter. She looked out at the formation, her gaze moving slowly across every face, lingering slightly longer on some than others. So, she said, straightening despite the visible ache in her shoulder, we're going to finish today's evaluation. And I want every single one of you to understand that what you do for the rest of this afternoon isn't just about passing a training exercise anymore. It's about proving to me, and more importantly to yourselves, whether you're the kind of person someone should be able to count on when everything goes wrong. Twist the stakes change. Whitfield stepped forward, glancing between Emily and Reynolds with obvious concern. Ma'am, if there's an active situation developing, do you need to step away from this evaluation entirely? Not yet, Emily said. Fleet Command needs planning input, not an immediate departure. I have time, but I intend to use that time to finish exactly what I came here to do. She turned back to the recruits, her voice regaining the calm, commanding authority that had defined every moment since she'd first walked onto this range that morning. New drill, she said. Full gear, full pace, and this time no partners assigned by me. You choose who you trust enough to have beside you when things go wrong. Choose carefully, because in about 90 seconds, I'm going to introduce complications to this course that none of you are expecting, and the only thing that will get you through them is whether you picked the right person to stand beside. Ryan glanced at Tommy, then at Jenna, then somewhat unexpectedly extended his hand toward a recruit he'd barely spoken to all morning, a wiry young Marine candidate named Elena Vasquez, who had said almost nothing during the entire evaluation, but had quietly outperformed nearly everyone on the initial marksmanship drill. Partner up, Ryan asked. Elena studied him for a moment, clearly surprised by the request. You barely know me. I know you shot better than I did this morning, Ryan said. And I know I spent half of today being an arrogant idiot instead of paying attention to who actually deserved respect. I'd like to fix that, starting now. Elena's expression softened slightly. All right, Caldwell, don't make me regret it. Mini-climax complications begin. Whitfield activated a series of smoke canisters positioned along the course. Thick gray clouds billowing across the obstacles within seconds, dramatically reducing visibility in a rough approximation of the storm conditions Emily had described from her own operation years earlier. Move. Emily's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. Complications don't wait for convenient timing. Neither should you. Recruits scrambled through the reduced visibility, coughing against the acrid smoke gear, rattling against their bodies as they navigated obstacles they could barely see. Ryan grabbed Elena's sleeve at one point, steering her away from a sandbag barrier she hadn't seen through the haze. Thanks, she gasped. Don't thank me yet, Ryan said. We're not through this. Jenna and Sarah pushed through together, calling coordinates to each other in short, clipped bursts that echoed the exact kind of communication Emily had described from her own team years earlier, proof that some lesson from the morning story had already sunk in deep enough to change how they operated under pressure. Tommy partnered with a recruit named Marcus Webb, hit the low-crawl trench just as another smoke canister ignited nearby, and for a terrifying moment completely lost his bearings in the churning gray haze. Webb, he shouted. Where are you? Here, came the reply, muffled and distant. Follow my voice. Tommy crawled forward blindly, panic edging into his chest, until a hand suddenly gripped his shoulder and pulled him the final few feet toward clearer air. Got you, Webb said, breathing hard. Told you I wasn't leaving without you. Mini-climax Ryan's test. The final obstacle waited at the edge of the smoke-obscured course, a rope bridge suspended over a sandpit, deliberately positioned to test balance and composure under the exact kind of blind, disorienting conditions Emily had survived years earlier. Ryan reached it first, Elena close behind him, both of them coughing from the lingering smoke exhaustion, pulling at every muscle beneath the weight of their gear. "You go first," Ryan said. "I'll stabilize the ropes from this end." "Caldwell, that's not how the exercise works. We're supposed to cross together." "I know how it's supposed to work," Ryan said. "But your balance is better than mine. And if this bridge is as unstable as it looks, I'd rather know that before you're 40 feet up instead of after." Elena hesitated, studying him for a long moment. The same wiry young woman who had barely spoken to him all morning, suddenly seeing something in Ryan Caldwell that hadn't been visible at dawn. "All right," she said finally, "but you're right behind me. No heroics." "No heroics," Ryan agreed. She crossed carefully, testing each section of rope before committing her full weight, and when she reached the far side safely, she turned back and extended a hand toward Ryan for his own crossing, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever tension had existed between them that morning had genuinely dissolved into something resembling trust. Emily, watching from the sidelines with Reynolds standing quietly beside her, made a small note in her notebook. "That's the kid from this morning," Reynolds observed, "the one who mocked your jacket." "It is," Emily confirmed. "Looks like the lesson landed." "Looks like it," Emily agreed, "though lessons like that only stay landed if you keep choosing them every single day, long after the training range is gone." Twist the announcement. As the last recruits finally staggered across the finish line, coughing and exhausted smoke slowly clearing around them, Emily called the entire formation together one final time. Her expression had grown serious again, the earlier warmth from watching their progress replaced by something heavier. "You did well today," she said. "Better than I expected, if I'm honest. Some of you walked onto this range this morning believing your talent alone would carry you through anything. I hope you leave today understanding that talent is just the entry price. Character is what actually gets you through the door." She paused, glancing briefly toward Reynolds, who gave her a small, understanding nod. "I need to tell you something," she continued, "and I need you to understand why I'm telling you instead of simply walking away quietly the way I usually would." The recruits waited, sensing the shift in her tone. "3 years ago, in a sandstorm most of you have now heard about in more detail than any official report will ever contain, I served alongside a team leader named Marcus Cole, the man who trusted me to make an impossible shot, blind, who bled from a gunshot wound, while trusting 6 lives to a decision I made in less than 4 seconds. He survived that night because of trust communication and the willingness of every single person on that team to do their job even when everything had gone wrong." She let the words settle before continuing. "Marcus Cole is missing right now," Emily said. "Somewhere overseas in a region I know better than almost anyone else currently serving. His communication went dark 6 hours ago, and in a few minutes I'm going to walk off this range and begin planning how to bring him home." The formation erupted into murmurs, disbelief, and concern rippling through the recruits who hours earlier had known this woman only as a mysterious figure in a torn jacket. Mini-climax, a question. Nobody expected Ryan Caldwell step forward before he fully processed what he was about to say. "Ma'am, take me with you." The murmurs died instantly, replaced by stunned silence. Emily turned to look at him, studying his face carefully. The same recruit who had mocked her jacket at dawn, now standing in front of her, exhausted, dirt-streaked, and utterly sincere. "You're a training candidate, Caldwell," she said, "not an operator with clearance for an active recovery mission." "I know that," Ryan said. "I'm not asking to go on the mission. I'm asking you to remember me. When this evaluation is finished, when you're back to training, the next class, when you need someone who's actually learned what you're trying to teach. I want to be that person." Emily studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her tired eyes. "That," she said finally, "is the first genuinely smart thing you've said all day." A ripple of exhausted, relieved laughter passed through the formation, breaking some of the heavy tension that had settled over the range. "Finish this evaluation," Emily said, addressing the entire group now. "Every single obstacle, every drill exactly as planned. Because right now, somewhere overseas, 4 people are counting on someone learning exactly the lessons you're learning today. Maybe not you specifically, maybe not this year, but someday one of you is going to be the person standing on a ridge in a storm, making an impossible decision with someone else's life hanging in the balance." She looked out at all of them one final time, her torn jacket catching in the desert wind, the scars beneath it hidden once more. but never forgotten by anyone who had heard her story that day. I need to know, she said quietly, that when that day comes, you'll be ready, cliffhanger to walking toward the unknown. Reynolds approached holding out a satellite phone, his expression grim. Command's waiting for your answer, Emily. They need to know within the hour whether you're joining the recovery team directly or staying stateside for planning support only. Emily took the phone, staring at it for a long moment, the weight of the decision evident in every line of her tired, scarred face. Jenna Ruiz, watching from a few feet away, found herself holding her breath without realizing it. Tommy stood frozen. Even Ryan, who had spent the entire morning convinced he understood everything worth knowing about strength and courage, found himself utterly unable to guess what she would decide. Emily raised the phone to her ear. This is Carter, she said, her voice steady despite everything churning beneath the surface. I need operational details before I answer that question. Give me everything you have on Cole's last known position. She turned and began walking toward the command tent, her torn jacket trailing slightly in the wind, her limp barely noticeable despite the old wound that still after 3 years occasionally reminded her of exactly what that kind of decision could cost. The recruits watched her go in silence, none of them yet knowing whether the woman who had spent an entire day teaching them the difference between confidence and character was about to walk directly back into the kind of storm that had once nearly taken everything from her. Emily stood near the command tent with the satellite phone pressed to her ear, listening to a voice on the other end reading off coordinates and status updates in the clipped, careful language of someone who had delivered this kind of briefing more times than they wanted to count. The recruits watched from a distance, none of them daring to move closer, though every single one of them strained to catch fragments of what was being said. Say that again, Emily said into the phone, her voice sharpening. The convoy diverted from the planned route 2 hours before contact was lost. A pause while the voice on the other end confirmed. That's not a coincidence, Emily said. Somebody had advanced knowledge of their movement. Reynolds, standing beside her, exchanged a glance that carried the weight of a conclusion neither of them wanted to say out loud in front of the recruits. Copy, Emily said finally. I need full satellite imagery of the last known position, and I need it inside 20 minutes. And Michael, she turned slightly away from the group, though her voice still carried. I need to know if this is the same network operating in that region. The one from 3 years ago. The line went quiet for a moment. They can't confirm it yet, Emily said, relaying the answer to Reynolds without needing to repeat the question. But the operational pattern matches. Mini-climax, the old enemy, Jenna Ruiz felt a chill crawl up her spine despite the desert heat pressing down on the range. The same people, she whispered to Tommy. The ones from her story, the compound, the sandstorm. You think it's really them? Tommy asked. I think, Jenna said slowly, that some stories don't actually end when the storyteller stops talking. Ryan Caldwell said nothing, but his jaw had tightened into a hard, focused line, watching Emily with an intensity that hadn't been there that morning when he'd mocked her torn jacket in front of the entire formation. Something had shifted in him over the last several hours, and it was showing now in the way he stood, the way he listened, the way he seemed to actually see the woman in front of him, instead of the tired, unimpressive figure he'd dismissed at dawn. Emily ended the call and stood still for a long moment, staring at the phone in her hand like it held more weight than its physical size suggested. Ma'am, Whitfield said carefully, approaching from the side. What's the assessment? The assessment, Emily said, is that Marcus Cole and his team drove directly into a trap that somebody set with inside knowledge of their route, which means this wasn't random. Which means whoever's holding them wanted them specifically. Why would anyone want a security contracting team? Tommy asked, unable to stop himself from stepping closer. Emily's eyes moved toward him, and for a moment something flickered behind them. Old grief mixed with something colder, more calculating. Because Marcus Cole isn't just a contractor, she said. He's the man who led the team that extracted a high-value hostage from that same network 3 years ago. If this is the same organization, they've had 3 years to remember exactly who cost them that operation and exactly who they'd like to get their hands on in return. The words landed heavy across the formation. Reynolds' expression darkened. You think this is retaliation, he said. I think, Emily said, that I need to see that satellite imagery before I confirm anything. But I also think we don't have the luxury of waiting to find out, Twist the volunteer. 20 minutes later, inside a briefing tent hastily assembled at the edge of the training range, Emily stood over a table covered in printed satellite images, terrain maps, and a laptop displaying encrypted communication logs. Reynolds stood across from her, along with two other officers who had arrived by vehicle. Within the last 10 minutes, their expressions grim and focused. Last confirmed position, Reynolds said, tapping a location on the map, puts them here in a stretch of terrain surrounded by dry riverbeds and low ridgelines. Difficult approach from every direction except this narrow corridor to the northeast. Emily studied the map with the intense practice focus of someone who had spent years learning to read terrain like a language. That corridor's a funnel, she said. If I were setting an ambush position for anyone attempting a rescue approach, that's exactly where I'd put it. Which means whoever's holding them either doesn't know standard tactical doctrine, Emily said, or they're counting on rescuers using the obvious route and walking straight into a second trap. One of the unfamiliar officers, a sharp-featured woman introduced only as Colonel Reyes, leaned forward. Senior Chief Carter Fleet Command has authorized a 4-person recovery team insertion within 18 hours. We need your decision on field participation before we finalize personnel. Emily's hand rested against the edge of the table, the old scar along her forearm visible beneath her rolled sleeve, now that the jacket hung open at her side. I'm in, she said. Reynolds' jaw tightened. Emily, your last field evaluation was 14 months ago. Your shoulder mobility is still documented as restricted in your last physical. My shoulder mobility, Emily said evenly, was good enough this morning to put a round dead center at 800 yards in front of 30 witnesses. I think it'll hold up fine. That's not the same as sustained field operations under hostile conditions. No, Emily agreed, it's not. But I know this terrain, I know this network's tactics, and there is exactly one other person alive who's operated successfully against them before, and he's currently somewhere in that corridor, hoping somebody remembers what he taught them about not giving up. The tent went quiet. Colonel Reyes studied Emily for a long moment before finally nodding. I'll authorize it, she said, but Carter, I need you medically cleared within the hour, and I need a support plan that accounts for your physical limitations. This isn't a solo operation. You'll have a team. Understood, Emily said. Mini-climax Reynolds' concern. As the briefing dispersed, Reynolds pulled Emily aside, his expression carrying a weight she hadn't seen from him in years. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Yes, I do. Emily, I've known you for 6 years. I watched you walk out of that field hospital after the storm, barely able to stand. And I watched you push through recovery faster than any doctor thought possible, because you refuse to accept anything less than full function. I'm not questioning your capability. I'm questioning whether you actually want to go back into that region, or whether you feel like you owe it to Danny's memory to keep proving something that doesn't need proving anymore. Emily's expression tightened, and for a moment the disciplined calm slipped just enough to reveal something raw underneath. Marcus Cole bled out half his blood supply on a valley floor because I made a shot nobody thought was possible, she said. He trusted me with his life and the lives of 5 other men that night, and I brought every single one of them home. If he's out there right now, scared, wounded, wondering if anyone's coming, I am not going to be the person who decided training recruits mattered more than finishing what I started with him 3 years ago. And if something happens to you this time, Reynolds asked quietly, what happens to everything you were trying to teach these recruits about the difference between courage and recklessness? Emily held his gaze for a long moment. Then they'll learn, she said, that sometimes courage means walking back into the exact storm that nearly killed you, because the alternative is living with the knowledge that you could have helped and chose safety instead. Reynolds didn't have an answer for that. He simply nodded once and stepped back. Cliffhanger, the recruits learned the plan. Word spread through the formation quickly, the way important information always seemed to find its way to every corner of a base within minutes, despite official channels insisting otherwise. By the time Emily emerged from the briefing tent, every recruit stood waiting, restless energy replacing the exhaustion from the morning's obstacle course. You're going, Jenna said, not quite a question. I am, Emily confirmed. When insertion is planned within 18 hours. Emily's eyes moved across the formation, settling briefly on each face, which means this evaluation is officially concluded early. I need every one of you to understand something before I leave this range. She stepped closer, and something in her posture commanded absolute attention, despite the exhaustion visible in every line of her face. Today was never really about marksmanship, she said. It was never really about obstacle courses or timed drills. It was about finding out who you are when the easy assumptions get stripped away. Some of you learned that lesson through humility. Her gaze flicked briefly toward Ryan. Some of you learned it through struggle. All of you are walking away from this range today different than you walked onto it this morning, whether you realize it yet or not. Ma'am, Ryan said, suddenly stepping forward. Let me help. Not in the field. I know I don't have clearance for that. But there has to be something. Communications, support, logistics, anything. Emily studied him for a long moment. The same recruit who had grabbed her jacket collar that morning, now standing in front of her, with genuine desperate sincerity in his expression. There is something, she said slowly. Twist an unexpected assignment. Colonel Reyes mentioned they're short-staffed on the operations planning cell, Emily said. Analysts who can process satellite imagery cross-reference terrain data track communication patterns. It's not field work, Caldwell. It's a desk. But it's a desk that could genuinely make the difference between this recovery succeeding or failing. Ryan's expression shifted disappointment, flickering briefly before something more determined replaced it. I'll take it, he said immediately. You don't even know what it involves yet. I don't care, Ryan said. This morning I laughed at you because I thought strength only looked one way. I'm not making that mistake again. If a desk is where I can actually help, then that's where I want to be. Emily allowed herself the smallest, tiredest hint of a smile. All right, Caldwell. Report to Colonel Reyes' team within the hour. Do exactly as you are told to ask questions when you don't understand something, and remember that the information you process might be the difference between someone's father coming home or not. Yes, ma'am. Jenna stepped forward next. What about the rest of us? The rest of you, Emily said. Finish your evaluation as planned. New instructors will take over for the remainder of the week. But I want you to remember something while you're training. Somewhere out there right now, 4 people are depending on strangers they've never met to come find them. That's not an abstract lesson anymore. That's happening in real time tonight while you're sleeping in your bunks. The formation stood in heavy silence, the weight of that reality settling differently over each of them than any lecture or drill could have accomplished. Mini-climax preparing to leave. By the time evening approached, Emily stood inside a secured briefing room, reviewing final operational details with the 3-person field team assigned to accompany her, a broad-shouldered former ranger named Diaz, a communications specialist named Foster, and a young but highly capable medic named Ochoa who had specifically requested this assignment after hearing about the classified nature of the mission. Insertion point is Chihiriu, Diaz said, tapping a location on the digital terrain map. 14 kilometers from Cole's last known position, moving in under cover of darkness. That corridor Colonel Reyes flagged, Emily said. I want eyes on it before we commit to any approach route. If this network learned anything from what happened 3 years ago, they'll be watching that exact path expecting a rescue attempt. You think they're using Cole and his team as bait, Ochoa said. I think Emily said that whoever set this trap knows exactly who's likely to respond to a call for help in this region. And I think they're hoping I'm arrogant enough to walk the same road I would have used 3 years ago. So we don't use it, Foster said. We use the terrain nobody expects, Emily said, tracing a different path across the map, one that wound through significantly rougher ground, longer, more exhausting, but far less predictable. It costs us 4 extra hours, but it might cost us a lot less than an ambush. Diaz studied the alternate route with obvious respect. That's not in any standard operating procedure. No, Emily agreed, it's not. Standard procedure gets people killed when the enemy's had 3 years to study standard procedure. Twist a message from the past. As the team finalized their approach plan, a notification chimed on the secure laptop in front of Foster, who frowned at the screen for a moment before looking up sharply. Senior Chief, he said, you need to see this. Emily crossed the room and leaned over his shoulder. On the screen was an intercepted communication partially decrypted, flagged as high priority by the intelligence cell monitoring regional chatter. They're talking about a name, Foster said quietly. Multiple mentions over the last 4 hours. Encrypted, but the pattern analysis suggests it's a specific individual they're either targeting or expecting. What name? Emily said, though something in her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. Foster turned the screen towards her and Emily's breath caught in her throat. The partially decrypted text, fragmentary and imperfect, contained a phrase that translated roughly to a phonetic approximation of a name she hadn't heard spoken by an enemy in 3 years. Silent Ghost. Mini-climax, they know she's coming. The room went completely still. "They're expecting you," Ochoa said slowly. "Specifically you." "That's not possible," Diaz said. "Nobody outside a classified circle knows that designation." "Somebody clearly does," Emily said, her voice tight with controlled tension. "Which means either there's a security breach somewhere in our own operational chain, or this network has been planning something involving me specifically for a very long time." 3 years is a long time to hold a grudge, Foster said quietly. 3 years is exactly enough time, Emily said, for an organization that lost their most valuable hostage situation to a single blind shot in a sandstorm to plan revenge with patience instead of panic. Reynolds, who had entered the room moments earlier to check on final preparations, went pale as he absorbed what he was hearing. "Emily, if they're specifically targeting you, this changes the entire risk calculation. Command needs to reconsider your field participation." "No," Emily said immediately, sharper than she intended. "If they specifically want me, that means Marcus Cole and his team are the leverage they're using to draw me in, which means the moment they get what they actually want, Marcus becomes disposable." The weight of that realization settled heavily over the room. "If I don't go," Emily said quietly, "they have no reason to keep him alive. Cliffhanger the trap." Within the trap, Colonel Reyes arrived within minutes of being briefed on the intercepted communication, her expression sharp with the particular focus of someone rapidly recalculating an entire operational plan. "This changes everything," she said. "If they're using Cole's team as bait specifically to draw you into that corridor, then the ambush isn't just tactical anymore. It's personal. They want a confrontation with you directly." "Then let's give them one," Emily said. "On our terms, not theirs." "Emily, that's an enormous risk." "With respect, Colonel, the risk already exists whether I acknowledge it or not," Emily said. "The only question now is whether we walk into their trap blind or whether we use the fact that they've revealed their hand to build a counter to it." Reyes studied her for a long moment, then looked to Reynolds, who gave a small, reluctant nod. "Talk me through it," Reyes said finally. Emily leaned over the map again, her mind already racing through possibilities. The same calculating focus that had once found an invisible target through a wall of sand now turning toward an enemy who had made the mistake of revealing they knew her name. "If they were watching that corridor expecting me," she said, "then I use the alternate approach we already planned. But I also make sure they see exactly what they're expecting to see moving toward that corridor until the last possible moment." "A decoy," Diaz said, understanding dawning. "A decoy," Emily confirmed. "Foster, can you generate a communication signature that mimics my typical field patterns, something they'd pick up on their monitoring equipment moving toward that funnel corridor?" "I can try," Foster said. "It won't be perfect." "It doesn't need to be perfect," Emily said. "It just needs to buy us enough time to reach Cole's actual position from a direction they're not watching." Mini-climax Elena's question. Word of the developing plan had reached even the recruits still finishing their evaluation nearby, filtered through fragments, overheard, and hushed speculation. Elena Vasquez, the quiet Marine candidate who had partnered with Ryan through the smoke-filled obstacle course, found herself standing near the operations tent during a brief lull, watching the controlled chaos of last-minute mission preparation unfold. "You really think she'll be all right?" Elena asked Ryan, who had already begun working alongside the analyst processing terrain data. Ryan didn't look up from the satellite image he was studying, cross-referencing elevation changes against the alternate route Emily's team intended to use. "I think," he said slowly, "that a woman who took a blind shot at 900 meters through a sandstorm probably doesn't need my confidence to survive whatever's waiting for her out there." "That's not really an answer." Ryan finally looked up, exhaustion and worry visible in his expression, despite his attempt at composure. "No," he admitted, "it's not, but it's the only one I've got right now." He turned back to the screen, his fingers already moving to flag a discrepancy in the elevation data that didn't quite match the earlier satellite pass. "Wait," he said suddenly, "this doesn't add up. Twist the discrepancy." "What doesn't add up?" Foster asked, glancing over from his own station. "This ridge here," Ryan said, pointing to a section of the alternate route Emily's team intended to use. "The satellite pass from 6 hours ago shows it as clear terrain, But this thermal imagery from 90 minutes ago is showing heat signatures along the same ridgeline that weren't there before. Foster leaned closer, studying the data. You're right, that's new. How many signatures? Emily asked, appearing at Ryan's shoulder so quickly he nearly jumped. 3, maybe 4, Ryan said. Stationary, spaced roughly 40 meters apart. That's not a random pattern. Emily's expression darkened as she studied the thermal data herself. That's an observation post, she said. They're not just watching the obvious corridor. They anticipated we might try an alternate route and positioned a secondary watch position to cover it. They thought of everything, Diaz said grimly. They had 3 years to think of everything, Emily said, which means we need a third option. Something they haven't had time to anticipate because it doesn't exist yet. She stared at the map for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing visibly against her exhausted features. Caldwell, she said finally. Good catch. That discrepancy might have saved 4 lives tonight. Ryan felt something complicated settle in his chest, pride mixed with fear, mixed with a sudden, overwhelming realization that the stakes of what he was doing had just become terrifyingly real. Mini-climax, a new plan forms. If they've got eyes on both the obvious corridor and our alternate route, Emily said, studying the terrain with renewed intensity, then our only remaining option is the one path nobody would consider viable. She traced a line across the map that made even Diaz, the most experienced field operator in the room, visibly tense. That's a direct approach across open desert, he said. No cover for nearly 6 kilometers. In daylight, that's suicide. Even at night, with thermal capability on their side, we'd be exposed the entire way. Which is exactly why they wouldn't expect it, Emily said. Nobody sane approaches a fortified position across 6 kilometers of open ground with 0 cover. That's precisely the kind of decision that only makes sense if you're desperate enough or confident enough to bet everything on being underestimated one more time. Emily, Reynolds said quietly, that's an enormous gamble. Everything about tonight is an enormous gamble, Emily said. The only question is which gamble gives Marcus Cole the best chance of still being alive when we reach him. Colonel Reyes studied the proposed route for a long, tense moment before finally exhaling. I'll authorize additional air support standing by for immediate extraction if the approach is detected. But Carter, if this goes wrong, there's no fallback plan. You understand that? I understand it, Emily said. I've understood exactly that kind of stakes before. It's the only kind of stakes that's ever actually mattered in this line of work. Cliffhanger final preparations. As the team completed final equipment checks, Emily found a quiet moment near the edge of the operations tent, checking the weight and function of her rifle with the same methodical care she'd shown that morning on the training range an entire lifetime ago. It now felt like, though, barely 12 hours had actually passed. Jenna Ruiz approached hesitantly, still in her training gear, dirt and sweat from the day's exercises still visible on her uniform. Ma'am, she said quietly, I know I'm not part of this. I know I don't have any right to ask, but is there anything I can do? Emily looked up, something softening slightly in her exhausted expression at the sincerity in the young recruit's voice. There is actually, she said. Stay ready. Whatever happens tonight, this evaluation continues tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. The lessons don't stop just because tonight is dangerous. If anything, tonight is exactly why those lessons matter. That's not really what I meant. I know what you meant, Emily said gently, and I appreciate it more than you probably realize. But the best thing you can do for me right now is become exactly the kind of operator who someday makes a night like this a little less necessary. Someone whose team never gets ambushed in the first place because you've learned to see the traps before they're sprung. Jenna nodded, throat tight with emotion she didn't fully understand. Emily finished checking her gear, slung her rifle across her back, and pulled her torn jacket tighter against the growing evening chill. The same jacket that had been mocked at dawn, that had survived a sandstorm 3 years earlier, that now carried her one final time toward a corridor of desert where an old enemy waited, believing they finally understood exactly how to draw out the ghost that had haunted them for 3 long years. She was wrong about one thing, though, and Emily intended to make absolutely certain they discovered exactly how wrong before the night was finished. Twist the helicopter lifts off. The transport helicopter's rotors began spinning up as the final light of day bled out of the desert sky, its dull roar swallowing the last quiet moments before departure. Emily climbed aboard alongside Diaz, Foster, and Ochoa, each of them checking gear one final time with the practiced efficiency of professionals who understood exactly what waited ahead. Reynolds stood at the edge of the landing zone, watching with an expression that carried 6 years of professional respect mixed with something far more personal. "Bring them home," he called over the rotor noise. "Always intended to," Emily called back. As the helicopter lifted off into the darkening sky, Emily caught one final glimpse of the training range below, the recruits standing in a loose formation, watching her departure of Ryan Caldwell, standing slightly apart from the others, still wearing the intense, focused expression of someone determined to prove that the lesson from that morning had truly changed him. She thought of Danny Okafor of the Storm 3 years ago, of Marcus Cole's voice cracking with pain and determination over a broken radio signal. She thought of the torn jacket wrapped tight around her shoulders, carrying every scar and every lesson from every impossible moment that had brought her to exactly this point. The helicopter banked east toward the darkening horizon, toward a corridor of desert, where an enemy believed they had finally set the perfect trap. They had no idea that the woman flying toward them had already survived their worst, and had spent 3 years since then learning exactly how to make sure it never happened to anyone else again. Below on the quiet training range, Ryan Caldwell watched the helicopter's lights disappear into the darkness and found himself praying for the first time in longer than he could remember that the universe would show mercy to a woman who had spent her entire life refusing to ask for any. The helicopter cut through the darkness at low altitude. Engines throttled back as much as possible to minimize the sound signature carrying across the open desert below. Emily sat with her rifle across her knees, eyes closed, running through the approach plan one final time. Every variable, every contingency, every worst-case scenario she could imagine layered on top of the ones Diaz and Foster had already wargamed during the flight. 10 minutes to insertion point, the pilot's voice crackled through her headset. Emily opened her eyes. Across from her, Ochoa checked his medical kit for the third time, hands moving with the nervous energy of someone who understood exactly what kind of injuries he might be treating within the hour. Diaz sat perfectly still, the calm of a man who had done this enough times that stillness had become its own kind of readiness. "Talk to me about Cole," Emily said, breaking the tense silence. "Anything in his file that changes our approach." "Nothing new," Foster said, scrolling through data on a tablet shielded from outside light. "Former Staff Sergeant, 6 years Special Operations before transitioning to contracting. Wife, 2 kids back stateside. According to his contract file, he specifically requested assignments in this region. Something about wanting to finish what he started." Emily's jaw tightened. "He never mentioned that to me." "Would it have changed anything?" "No," Emily admitted, "but I would have told him he was an idiot for coming back here voluntarily." "Takes one to know one," Diaz said quietly, and despite everything, the corner of Emily's mouth twitched into something almost like a smile. Mini-climax wheels down. The helicopter touched down in a shallow depression, 11 kilometers from the target position, rotors kicking up a storm of dust that swallowed the aircraft completely for several seconds before the team disembarked and the helicopter lifted away into the darkness, leaving them alone in absolute silence. "Radio check," Emily whispered. "Foster up. Diaz up. Ochoa up." "Overwatch is up," Emily confirmed, her voice barely audible even to the team standing beside her. "We move on my mark. 6 kilometers of open ground. No cover. No margin for noise discipline failures. If anyone's compromised, we do not stop for extraction. We push forward and complete the mission." "Understood." 3 quiet affirmations answered her. They moved into the darkness in a staggered formation, low and fast boots, finding silent purchase on hardened desert earth that Emily had memorized down to the smallest terrain feature during the flight. Every 100 meters she paused, scanning the horizon through her night vision, checking for any sign that their approach had been detected. Nothing. Just silent stars and the growing weight of 6 kilometers stretching out ahead of them like an accusation. "You doing all right?" Diaz asked quietly during one of their brief pauses, noticing the slight favor Emily was giving her left ankle. "I'm fine. That's the same thing you told your spotter 3 years ago, right before an explosion nearly took your arm off," Diaz said. "Forgive me if I don't fully trust the word fine coming from you." Emily allowed herself a small, tired breath of amusement. "Fair point. It aches. It'll hold." "That's better." They pushed forward. Mini-climax, the first sign of trouble. 2 kilometers from the target position, Foster's hand shot up sharply, freezing the entire formation in place. "Movement," he whispered, pointing toward a low ridge nearly 400 meters ahead. 2 figures stationary, elevated position. Emily raised her scope, scanning the darkness until she found them, two silhouettes crouched behind a rocky outcropping, weapons visible even through the grainy green tint of night vision. "That's not the observation post Caldwell flagged," she whispered. "That's a new position, closer to the target than anything we mapped." "They adding security?" Diaz asked. "Or they're expecting company," Emily said grimly. She studied the two figures for a long moment, calculating angles, distances, when the same instinctive process that had once found an invisible target through a wall of sand. "We go around," she decided. "Wide swing east adds 20 minutes but keeps us out of their sightline." 20 minutes we don't necessarily have," Foster said quietly. 20 minutes is better than a compromised approach," Emily said. "Move. Twist contact." They had covered barely 300 meters of the detour when the radio in Foster's earpiece crackled with a transmission that made his entire body go rigid. He held up a fist, freezing the team, then pressed his hand against his earpiece, listening intently for several agonizing seconds before turning to Emily with an expression that told her everything before he even spoke. "Command's picking up radio chatter from the target compound," he whispered. "Encrypted, but the pattern analyst flagged increased activity in the last 4 minutes. Something's happening." "What kind of something?" "They don't know yet. Could be a shift change, could be..." A distant sound cut through the desert silence, sharp and unmistakable even at this distance. Gunfire. Emily's blood went cold, the sound dragging her mind instantly back to a sandstorm 3 years earlier, to a radio crackling with the same terrible noise, to Marcus Cole's voice fracturing with pain and desperation. "That's not us," Diaz said, weapon already raised, scanning the darkness. "That's coming from the compound." "They're not shooting at anyone approaching," Emily said, her voice tight with dawning horror. "That's execution style. Controlled bursts, not a firefight." "You think they're..." Ochoa couldn't finish the sentence. "I think," Emily said, already moving, discipline overriding the panic clawing at her chest, "that we do not have 20 minutes anymore. Diaz, Foster, we take the direct route. Ochoa, stay 50 meters behind us with medical gear ready. If this goes bad, I need you able to move fast without exposure." "Emily, the direct route puts us in view of that observation post." "I am aware of that, Diaz." Move, mini-climax racing against time. They ran now, discipline bending under the weight of urgency, boots pounding against hardened earth as the compound silhouette grew larger against the star-filled horizon. Emily's ankles screamed with every stride, old injury reawakened by the punishing pace, but she pushed the pain into some distant corner of her mind and kept moving. "Position acquired," Diaz whispered as they reached a low ridge overlooking the compound from 400 meters out. "I count 6 hostiles moving agitated. That's not standard patrol behavior." Emily raised her scope, scanning across the compound's interior through gaps in the perimeter wall, searching desperately for any sign of Cole and his team. There. 4 figures kneeling in the compound's central courtyard, hands bound, surrounded by armed men, whose body language radiated barely controlled aggression. "I have eyes on the hostages," Emily whispered. "All 4 alive, but this is deteriorating fast." "What are they doing?" Foster asked. Emily studied the scene for a horrifying, clarifying second, and understanding crashed over her like ice water. "They're staging an execution," she said. "They know we're close. Somebody tipped them off, or they detected something during our approach. They're not waiting for a negotiation anymore. They're making sure that if this rescue happens at all, it happens too late to matter. Twist the impossible choice." "We need immediate action," Emily said, already calculating angles, distances, the exact geometry of an impossible shot she'd been forced to take once before. "Diaz, I need eyes on that gunman closest to Cole, the one giving orders." "Got him," Diaz confirmed. Center of the group elevated slightly on a raised platform. "That's 400 meters moderate elevation change, and I have 3 other armed hostiles within 20 feet of the hostages," Emily said, voice tight with controlled focus. "If I miss, or if this goes loud too early, they execute all 4 before we can move." "What's the play?" Foster asked. Emily's mind raced through every option, every variable, every lesson learned across a lifetime spent making decisions in exactly these kinds of impossible margins. "I take the lead gunman first," she said. "The moment he drops Diaz, you and Foster move on the 2 nearest the hostages before they can react. Ochoa, the second you hear the first shot, you're moving in for medical support. This has to happen in under 8 seconds, from first shot to full engagement, or we lose the element of surprise completely. 8 seconds, Diaz repeated. That's aggressive. 8 seconds is generous, Emily said. We might have 4. She settled into position, the familiar weight of the rifle against her shoulder, bringing back memories she'd spent 3 years trying to both honor and outrun. Below in the compound courtyard, Marcus Cole knelt with his head bowed, blood visible on his shirt. From an untreated wound, his posture radiating the particular exhaustion of a man who had accepted the worst outcome and was simply waiting for it to arrive. Emily's finger found the trigger. I'm coming, Marcus. Just hold on a few more seconds. Mini-climax the shot. Wind's calm, Diaz whispered. Clean shot, no obstruction. Emily exhaled slowly, every ounce of pain in her ankle, every year of accumulated grief for Danny Okafor, every lesson she'd taught a formation of recruits just 12 hours earlier about the difference between confidence and readiness, all of it narrowed down into a single focus point of absolute clarity. She fired. The lead gunman dropped instantly, and the compound erupted into immediate chaos. Diaz and Foster surged forward exactly as planned, weapons raised, moving with brutal efficiency that eliminated the 2 nearest threats within seconds of Emily's shot landing. But the third gunman, the one Emily hadn't had a clean angle on, spun toward the hostages with his weapon raised, and for one horrifying, suspended moment, Emily watched through her scope as his finger tightened against the trigger, aimed directly at Marcus Cole's kneeling form. No, she shouted, already firing again, the shot cracking across the desert night a fraction of a second before the gunman could complete his own. Her round found him first. He fell. The compound went silent, except for the ringing echo of gunfire fading into the desert darkness, and the frantic, desperate sound of 4 bound hostages realizing all at once that they were still alive. Twist Marcus, Emily was moving before she'd even fully processed that the immediate threat had been eliminated, sprinting down the ridge toward the compound with a speed that ignored every scream of protest from her injured ankle. Clear, Diaz called from inside the compound wall. Perimeter secure, no additional hostiles. Emily burst through the compound gate and found Marcus Cole exactly where she'd seen him through her scope, slumped forward, hands still bound, blood soaking through his shirt from a wound that looked far worse up close than it had through magnified optics. Marcus, his head snapped up at the sound of her voice, disbelief and exhaustion warring across his features as recognition dawned. Emily, his voice cracked barely more than a whisper. That's not possible. You're supposed to be training recruits, she said, already cutting through the rope, binding his wrists with quick, practiced motions. I know. Change of plans. You came, he said, and something in his voice broke entirely. 3 weeks of captivity and terror, finally cracking through the discipline that had held him together until this exact moment. I told them you wouldn't. I told them there was no way anyone even knew where we were. I always know where to find you, Marcus, Emily said, her own voice thick with emotion she didn't have time to fully process yet. You're not getting rid of me that easily. Ochoa arrived seconds later, immediately assessing Marcus's wound with practiced urgency. Gunshot through and through, missed anything critical, but he's lost significant blood. We need extraction now. Chopper's inbound, Foster confirmed, already relaying coordinates through his radio. 6 minutes, mini-climax. The others, while Ochoa worked on Marcus, Diaz and Foster freed the 3 remaining contractors, all of them shaken, exhausted, bearing various minor injuries from their captivity, but alive, unmistakably, impossibly alive. How did you find us? One of them asked, staring at Emily like she was some kind of apparition conjured directly out of desperate hope. Satellite analysis, terrain assessment, in a training recruit who caught a thermal imaging discrepancy. Nobody else noticed, Emily said. You can thank him personally when we're back stateside. Recruit, Marcus managed a weak, disbelieving laugh despite his obvious pain. You brought a training class into an active recovery operation. I brought the lessons from a training class, Emily corrected. The recruit stayed safely behind a desk exactly where he belonged, twist the warning. As Ochoa finished stabilizing Marcus for transport, Foster's radio crackled urgently. Senior Chief, we've got a problem, he said, listening intently to whatever was coming through his earpiece. Command's picking up vehicle movement approximately 8 kilometers out, moving toward this position at high speed. Reinforcements, Diaz said grimly. How many vehicles? 3, maybe 4. ETA approximately 11 minutes. Emily's mind raced through the math instantly. Chopper's 6 minutes out. We need to be airborne before that convoy arrives. Marcus needs stable ground for extraction, Ochoa said. Moving him now risks reopening this wound. Moving him is still safer than staying here when armed reinforcements arrive, Emily said. Anita. Prep him for immediate transport. Everyone else defensive positions at the compound perimeter. If that convoy arrives before our extraction, we hold this position exactly long enough to get everyone airborne. Mini-climax preparing for the worst. The team scrambled into position, adrenaline overriding exhaustion, as they fortified the compound's perimeter, using whatever cover the crude structure offered. Emily found a position along the eastern wall, scanning the darkness, where the approaching convoy would eventually appear, her rifle steady, despite the accumulated fatigue of the last several hours. You good? Diaz called from a nearby position. I'm always good, Emily said. It's the only setting I know how to operate in. That's not healthy. Neither is getting shot at repeatedly for a living, but here we are. Despite the tension, a strained laugh passed between them, the particular gallows humor that only exists among people who've learned to find levity in the exact moments that terrify them most. Marcus, propped against the compound wall while Ochoa monitored his vitals, watched Emily with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with obvious concern. You didn't have to come back into the field for this, he said quietly. Reynolds told me you'd transitioned to training. You could have stayed stateside, sent someone else. I could have, Emily agreed, but some debts you pay in person. I don't owe you a debt, Emily. You already saved my life once. And I'll keep saving it as many times as it takes, Emily said. That's not a debt, Marcus. That's just who I decided to be after that night in the storm. Twist convoy sighted. Vehicles visible, Diaz called out sharply. 6 kilometers closing fast. Chopper's 3 minutes out, Foster confirmed. That's cutting it close, Emily said, calculating rapidly. Diaz, Foster, hold this perimeter. I want early warning if they accelerate their approach. The next 3 minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, every second measured against the growing rumble of approaching vehicle engines and the distant, thankfully growing sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the night air. Choppers inbound, 90 seconds, Foster called. Convoys 2 kilometers out and closing. Diaz reported tension evident in every syllable. Ochoa, get Marcus ready for immediate transport the second that helicopter touches down, Emily ordered. We do not have time for a gentle loading process. Understood. The helicopter descended into the compound's central courtyard in a violent storm of dust and noise, rotors kicking up debris that stung against exposed skin. Emily helped Ochoa move Marcus toward the aircraft, his weight heavier than expected, his breathing shallow but steady. Almost there, Marcus, she said, half shouting over the rotor noise. Almost home. Mini-climax, the final moments on the ground. Convoys visible, Diaz shouted, already backing toward the helicopter while maintaining suppressive positioning. 1 kilometer in closing. The 3 freed contractors scrambled aboard, first followed by Ochoa, still monitoring Marcus's vitals even as they moved. Foster provided covering fire toward the darkness where the approaching convoy's headlights had just become visible, cresting a distant ridge. Emily, move, Diaz shouted. Emily hesitated for one final second, scanning the compound one last time. Some old instinct refusing to let her leave without absolute certainty that nothing had been left behind, that everyone who needed extraction was accounted for. Satisfied, she sprinted toward the helicopter, boots pounding against the compound's dusty ground as headlights from the approaching convoy swept across the terrain behind her. She threw herself aboard just as the helicopter began lifting off the ground, falling away beneath them, as the pilot banked sharply, gaining altitude and distance from the compound at maximum speed. Below, Emily watched through the open door as the convoy arrived at the now empty compound, seconds too late, headlights illuminating nothing but abandoned structures and the aftermath of a rescue they'd failed to prevent. We made it, Foster said, disbelief evident in his exhausted voice. We actually made it. Twist Marcus's confession as the helicopter climbed into the night sky, leaving the compound and its convoy of reinforcements far behind. Marcus reached weakly for Emily's hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his injuries. There's something you need to know, he said, voice strained but urgent, about why they specifically wanted you. Emily leaned closer, straining to hear him over the rotor noise. What do you mean? They didn't just randomly target a security contracting team, Marcus said. They knew who I was, knew my history with you. This whole operation, the ambush, the diverted route, that all of it was designed specifically to draw you back into this region. I know, Emily said grimly. We intercepted communications mentioning my designation. There's more, Marcus said, his expression tightening with something that looked almost like guilt. They have a new leader, someone who took over the network after the man you took out 3 years ago. And Emily, he paused, gathering strength for what he needed to say next. They told me his name before all this happened, before they tried to use me as bait. What name? Marcus's grip tightened on her hand. He goes by Al-Rashid now, he said. But 3 years ago, before he took command of this network, he had a different name. He was the man's son, the commander you eliminated during our extraction. This isn't just retaliation for a failed operation, Emily. This is his son, hunting you down for revenge. Cliffhanger, a new threat revealed. The helicopter cabin went quiet except for the roar of rotors, every person aboard absorbing the weight of what Marcus had just revealed. Emily sat back, processing the information with the same controlled focus she brought to every impossible calculation, but something in her expression had shifted the recognition that tonight's victory, however hard won, had not actually closed the chapter she'd believed was finished. He's not going to stop, she said quietly. Is he? No, Warstrom, Marcus said. Based on what I overheard during captivity, this was supposed to be the beginning, not the end. They wanted you drawn into this region specifically so they could study your tactics, your patterns before making a more permanent move. Foster exchanged a grim look with Diaz. That's not something we handle at the field team level. Command needs to know immediately. They will, Emily said, the second we land. She looked out at this darkness, rushing past the open helicopter door, at the desert that had once nearly taken everything from her and had now returned Marcus Cole to her exactly as she'd promised herself she would 3 years and 1 impossible shot ago. But somewhere out there in that same unforgiving landscape, a new enemy had emerged from the ashes of the old one, carrying a grudge that predated tonight's rescue by 3 long years, patient and calculating in exactly the way his father had never managed to be. Mini-climax. Return to base. The helicopter touched down at the forward operating base just before dawn, medical personnel rushing forward to receive Marcus and the other rescued contractors, the controlled chaos of a successful extraction unfolding around Emily as she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of exhaustion that had been held at bay by pure adrenaline for the last several hours. Reynolds was waiting on the tarmac, his relief evident even through his carefully maintained composure. You did it, he said as Emily approached her torn jacket, now stained with dust and dried blood that wasn't entirely her own. All 4 alive. All 4 alive, Emily confirmed, though her voice carried none of the triumph the words might have suggested. What's wrong? Emily relayed Marcus's revelation, quickly watching Reynolds' expression darken with the same grim understanding that had settled over the helicopter cabin during the flight back. This isn't finished, Reynolds said slowly. No, Emily agreed. It's not. What do you need? Emily looked out toward the horizon where the first hints of sunrise were beginning to color the sky, thinking of a training range 12 hours and an entire lifetime away, thinking of recruits who had spent a single day learning lessons that had once taken her years and immeasurable loss to fully understand. I need time, she said, to finish teaching the people who are going to be the ones facing whatever comes next. Because based on what Marcus just told me, this isn't a threat that ends with tonight's rescue. It's a threat that's just getting started. Twist the recruits, learn the outcome. Back at the training facility, word of the successful rescue spread through the recruit formation within hours, carried by official communications that Reynolds authorized specifically to give the exhausted, anxious trainees the resolution they'd been desperately waiting for. Ryan Caldwell was still hunched over the analysis station when the notification came through, having barely slept during the night, refusing to leave his post until word arrived one way or another about the mission's outcome. They made it. Foster's voice came through the secure line patched through from the forward base. All 4 hostages alive. Cole's stable in surgery now, but expected to make a full recovery. Ryan felt something release in his chest that he hadn't fully realized he'd been holding all night. A tension that had settled deep into his bones the moment that helicopter disappeared into the darkness 12 hours earlier. And Senior Chief Carter, he asked, unable to keep the urgency from his voice. Exhausted, Foster said, injured but stable. She's the reason all 4 of them are alive right now, Caldwell. That thermal discrepancy you flagged it saved this entire operation from walking into a second ambush. Ryan sat back in his chair, the weight of that statement settling over him with profound, humbling force. 12 hours ago, he'd been a recruit mocking a torn jacket. Now, in some small but genuinely significant way, he'd contributed to saving 4 lives on the other side of the world. Mini climax, Jenna's relief. Jenna Ruiz received the news standing near the same rope course where she'd watched Emily walk toward the command tent the previous afternoon, and the relief that flooded through her was so overwhelming that she had to sit down in the dirt for a moment, hands pressed against her face, allowing herself the release of emotion she'd been suppressing since Emily's helicopter disappeared into the darkness. "She's alive," Tommy said, finding her there moments later, his own eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and relief. "She actually did it." "Of course she did it," Jenna said, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Did you really think someone who took a blind shot in a sandstorm wouldn't figure out how to survive one more impossible mission?" "I don't know," Tommy admitted. 12 hours ago, I thought she was some tired old instructor in a torn jacket. Now I don't know what to think anymore, except that I want to become exactly the kind of person she is." That, Jenna said, is probably the entire point of everything that happened yesterday. Twist Ryan's realization. That evening, as the recruits gathered for what remained of their evaluation, now conducted by a new set of instructors, while Emily remained overseas coordinating the ongoing threat assessment, Ryan found himself standing near the same firing line where he'd mocked Emily's torn jacket less than 24 hours earlier. "You all right?" Elena asked, noticing his distant expression. "I keep thinking about what she said," Ryan admitted, "about talent being the entry price and character being what actually gets you through the door. I spent my whole life thinking talent was enough, that being good at something automatically made me somebody worth respecting. And now I understand that being good at something just means you have the opportunity to prove whether you're actually worth respecting," Ryan said. "The talent doesn't mean anything by itself. It's what you do with it, who you become because of it, that actually matters." Elena studied him for a long moment, something like genuine respect visible in her expression for the first time since they'd met. "That's a pretty significant realization for one day," she said. "Yeah, well," Ryan managed a tired, genuine smile. "I had a pretty significant teacher." Mini climax, a week later. 7 days passed before Emily finally returned to the training facility, her arm now bearing a fresh line of stitches beneath her jacket sleeve. Her limp slightly more pronounced than before, but her expression carrying the particular calm of someone who had faced down an old ghost and walked away having settled the debt she'd carried for 3 years. The recruits gathered to greet her, an unusual breach of standard protocol that Reynolds allowed without comment, understanding that some moments mattered more than procedure. "Marcus Cole made it through surgery," Emily announced without preamble, her voice carrying easily across the gathered formation. "Full recovery expected. He's already complaining about missing time with his daughters, which I'm choosing to interpret as a very good sign." A ripple of relieved laughter passed through the recruits. "The network responsible for the ambush has been identified and flagged for continued intelligence monitoring," she continued. "This isn't finished. It may never be entirely finished. But 4 people came home who weren't supposed to, and that matters more than any operational complications still ahead of us." Twist recognition. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, holding a small case that immediately drew every recruit's attention. "Senior Chief Carter has requested," he said, "that this recognition go not to herself, but to the recruit whose analytical work directly contributed to the mission's success." Ryan Caldwell felt every eye in the formation turned toward him, and something in his chest tightened with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming humility. "Caldwell," Emily said, "step forward." He did, though his legs felt strangely unsteady beneath him. 24 hours ago," Emily said, addressing the entire formation while looking directly at Ryan. "This recruit stood on this exact range and mocked a torn jacket, convinced that strength only looked one way. He was wrong, and to his enormous credit, he learned that lesson faster and more completely than any recruit I've evaluated in years." She opened the case, revealing a small commendation medal inside. "This isn't standard issue for a training evaluation," she said. "Command doesn't typically recognize training recruits for operational contributions. But when a recruit's analytical instincts directly prevent an ambush that would have cost 4 lives protocol becomes significantly less important than simply doing what's right." Ryan accepted the medal with hands that weren't entirely steady, throat too tight to manage more than a quiet, sincere thank you. Mini climax. The jacket's final lesson. As the formation began to disperse, Emily called out once more, drawing everyone's attention back toward her. "One more thing," she said, reaching into her canvas bag and withdrawing a folded piece of fabric that every recruit immediately recognized. Her torn jacket. "I've worn this jacket for 3 years," she said. "Through operations I'll never be able to fully discuss. Through grief I never expected to carry through a rescue mission last week that closed one chapter of my life, while opening another I didn't ask for, but intend to see through regardless." She held the jacket up slightly, running her thumb along the rough, imperfect stitching that had held it together through everything. "Some of you laughed at this jacket the first time you saw it," she said. "I understand why. It doesn't look impressive. It doesn't look like something a legend would wear. But that's exactly the point I need every single one of you to understand before you leave this training facility and go on to serve wherever your careers take you." She looked out at the formation, her gaze moving slowly across every face, cataloging the exhaustion, the growth, the transformation that had unfolded across these past several days. "The people who look the most unimpressive are often carrying the heaviest weight," she said. "The quiet ones, the tired ones, the ones wearing torn jackets instead of shiny new gear, they have usually already survived the exact thing you're training to face. Respect isn't something you extend based on how someone looks walking onto a range at dawn. It's something you extend because you've learned the hard way, if necessary, that appearances tell you almost nothing about what someone has actually survived." Twist, a final question. Tommy Briggs raised his hand hesitantly. "Ma'am, will you keep wearing it, the jacket I mean, even after everything?" Emily considered the question for a long moment, her fingers still resting against the worn fabric. "Yes," she said finally, "until it finally falls apart completely, and probably even after that in some form or another, because this jacket doesn't just remind me of what I've survived. It reminds me of who I want to keep being. Someone who chooses to show up imperfect and scarred and exhausted instead of hiding behind something polished and new that doesn't actually mean anything." She pulled the jacket back over her shoulders, the familiar weight settling into place, torn sleeve and rough stitching, and all the history it carried. "Every one of you is going to face a moment," she said, "where someone underestimates you because of how you look, how tired you seem, how unimpressive your circumstances appear on the surface. When that happens, I want you to remember this range. I want you to remember that the people who matter most rarely announce themselves loudly. They simply show up, do the work, and let their actions speak for everything their appearance never could." Mini climax, Ryan's question. "Ma'am," Ryan said, "what happens now to the network, I mean, to Al-Rashid?" Emily's expression grew serious, the weight of an unfinished chapter settling visibly across her tired features. "Now," she said, "we watch, we prepare, and we make sure that the next generation of operators, people like all of you, are ready for whatever comes next. Because some threats don't end cleanly. Some stories don't wrap up with a neat resolution. Sometimes the best you can do is make sure you're stronger, smarter, and more prepared than you were yesterday, and trust that preparation to carry you through whatever tomorrow decides to bring." "That's not a very comforting answer," Elena said quietly. "No," Emily agreed. "It's not comforting, but it's honest. And I'd rather give you honesty than false comfort, because false comfort gets people killed just as surely as arrogance does." Twist, the legacy continues. Weeks later, as the training class finally graduated and dispersed to their respective assignments across various branches of service, Emily stood once more on the same range where this entire journey had begun, watching a new class of recruits arrive for their own evaluation, young, confident, entirely unaware of what awaited them. Reynolds approached watching the new arrivals with the same weathered patience he'd shown throughout Emily's own evaluation weeks earlier. "Ready for round 2, he asked. "Always," Emily said. "You know, Reynolds said Caldwell requested a transfer, wants to work under your training program permanently once he completes his current assignment. Says he wants to help teach the lesson he learned firsthand." Emily allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "Good. We'll need people like him. People who've actually been humbled enough to teach humility honestly instead of just reciting it from a manual." She watched the new recruits gather at the edge of the range, young and eager, and completely unaware that the tired woman in the torn jacket walking toward them carried enough hard-won wisdom to change every single one of their lives if they were willing to actually listen. One of the new recruits, a young man with the same overconfident swagger Ryan Caldwell had once carried, elbowed his neighbor and gestured toward Emily with an expression of obvious dismissive amusement. Emily noticed. She always noticed. She simply kept walking, unhurried, unbothered, carrying the same quiet patience that had once turned an entire formation's mockery into profound, lasting respect. Because she understood something now that she hadn't fully grasped even 3 years earlier, standing in a sandstorm making an impossible shot to save 6 lives. Some lessons had to be learned again and again with every new class, every new generation of recruits who walked onto a training range believing that confidence alone would carry them through anything life could throw at them. And every single time she would be ready to teach them otherwise. The torn jacket settled against her shoulders as she reached the new formation, scars hidden beneath worn fabric, 3 years of grief and triumph and hard-earned wisdom carried quietly in every rough stitch and faded patch. "Good morning," she said, her voice calm and level, carrying easily across the assembled recruits. "My name is Senior Chief Emily Carter, and before this evaluation is finished, every single one of you is going to learn the difference between confidence and character." Somewhere in the formation, a young recruit smirked, already convinced he understood exactly what kind of morning this was going to be. He had absolutely no idea. And that, more than any medal, any classified mission, any impossible shot fired blind through a storm, was exactly the legacy Emily Carter had chosen to carry forward. One torn jacket, one humbled recruit, one saved life at a time for as long as she possibly could. Because true strength was never about being seen. It was about showing up anyway, especially when nobody was watching, especially when nobody believed you had anything left to prove. And Emily Carter, the woman they once laughed at, the woman who carried a nation's quiet gratitude beneath a torn and battered jacket, would keep showing up for exactly as long as somebody somewhere needed a reminder that the most dangerous, most respected, most quietly courageous people in any room are rarely the ones announcing themselves the loudest. They are simply the ones who never stop choosing to stand back up.